Chapter 59. I receive an extraordinary message at the door of the long room, which, however, enter and affront the squire, who threatens to take the law of me, rebuke Melinda for her malice, she weeps with vexation. Lord Quiverwit is severe upon me, I retort his sarcasm, am received with the utmost tenderness by Narcissa, who desires to hear the story of my life. We vow eternal constancy to other. I retire, am waked by a messenger, who brings a challenge from Quiverwit, whom I meet, engage, and vanquish. I thanked him for his advice, which, however, my pride and resentment would not permit me to follow. For he no sooner left me, in order to do justice to my character among his friends and acquaintance, than I sallied out and went directly to the long room. I was met at the door by a servant, who presented a billet to me without a subscription, importing that my presence was disagreeable to the company, and desiring I would take the hint without further disturbance and bestow myself elsewhere for the future. This peremptory message filled me with indignation. I followed the fellow who delivered it, and, seizing him by the collar in presence of all the company, threatened to put him instantly to death, if he did not discover the scoundrel who had charged him with such an impudent commission, that I might punish him as he deserved. The messenger, affrighted at my menaces and furious looks, fell upon his knees, and told me that the gentleman who ordered him to deliver the letter was no other than Narcissa's brother, who, at that time, stood at the other end of the room, talking to Melinda. I went up to him immediately, and in the hearing of his inamorata accosted him in these words. "Look'ee, squire, were it not for one consideration that protects you from my resentment, I would cane you where you stand, for having had the presumption to send me this scurrilous intimation," which I tore to pieces and threw in his face. At the same time, darting an angry regard at his mistress, I told her I was sorry she had put it out of my power to compliment her upon her invention, but at the expense of her good nature and veracity. Her admirer, whose courage never rose, but in proportion to the wine he had swallowed, instead of resenting my address in what is called an honorable way, threatened to prosecute me for an assault and took witnesses accordingly. While she, piqued at his pusillanimous behavior and enraged at the sarcasm I had uttered against her, endeavored to make her quarrel a public cause, and wept aloud with spite and vexation. The tears of a lady could not fail of attracting the notice and concern of the spectators, to whom she complained of my rudeness with great bitterness, saying, if she were a man, I durst not use her so. The greatest part of the gentlemen, already prejudiced against me, were offended at the liberty I had taken, as appeared from their looks, though none of them signified their disgust any other way except my Lord Quiverwit, who ventured to say, with a sneer, that I was in the right to establish my own character, of which he had now no longer any doubt. Nettled at this severe equivocation, which raised a laugh at my expense, I replied with some warmth, I am proud of having in that particular got the start of your lordship. He made no answer to my repartee, but with a contemptuous smile walked off, leaving me in a very disagreeable situation. In vain did I make up to several people of my acquaintance, whose conversation, I hoped, would banish my confusion. Everybody shunned me like a person infected, and I should not have been able to bear my disgrace, had not the idea of the ever-faithful and fond Narcissa come to my relief. I quitted the scene of my mortification, and, sauntering about the town, happened to wake from my contemplation, when I found myself just opposite to a toy shop, which I entered, and purchased a ring set with a ruby in the form of a heart, surrounded by diamond sparks, for which I paid 10 guineas, intending it for a present to the charmer of my soul. I was introduced, at the hour appointed, to this divine creature, who, notwithstanding what she had heard to my disadvantage, received me with the utmost confidence and tenderness, and having been informed of the general sketches of my life by Miss Williams, expressed a desire of knowing the particular circumstances, which I related with great candor, omitting, however, some things which I concluded altogether improper for her ear, and which the reader's reflection will easily suggest. As my story was little else than a recital of misfortunes, the tear of sympathy ceased not to trickle from her enchanting eyes during the whole of the narration, which, when I had finished, she recompensed me for my trouble with the most endearing protestations of eternal love. She bewailed her restricted condition, as it was the means of retarding my happiness, told me that Lord Quiverwit, by her brother's permission, had been to drink tea with her that very afternoon and actually proposed marriage. And, seeing me extremely affected with this piece of information, offered to give me a convincing proof of her affection by espousing me in private and leaving the rest to fate. I was penetrated with this instance of her regard, but that I might not be outdone in generosity, resisted the bewitching temptation in consideration of her honor and interest. At the same time, I presented my ring as a pledge of my inviolable attachment, and, on my knees, implored heaven to shower its curses on my head, if ever my heart should entertain one thought unworthy of the passion I then avowed. She received my token, gave me in return her picture in miniature, exquisitely drawn and set in gold, and in the same posture, called heaven to witness and to judge her flame. Our vows being thus reciprocally breathed, a confidence of hope ensued, and our mutual fondness becoming as intimate as innocence would allow, I grew insensible of the progress of time, and it was morning before I could tear myself from this darling of my soul. My good angel foresaw what would happen, and permitted me to indulge myself on this occasion, in consideration of the fatal absence I was doomed to suffer. I went to bed immediately on my return to my lodging, and having slept about 2 hours was waked by Strap, who in great confusion told me there was a footman below with a letter, which he would deliver to nobody but myself. Alarmed at this piece of news, I desired my friend to show him into my chamber, and received the following letter, which, he said, required an immediate answer. Sir, when any man injures my honor, let the difference of rank between us be ever so great, I am contented to waive the privilege of my quality, and to seek reparation from him on equal terms. The insolence of your reply to me yesterday, in the long room, I might have overlooked, had not your presumptive emulation in a much more interesting affair, and which I made this morning, concurred in persuading me to chastise your audacity with my sword. If you therefore have spirit enough to support the character you assume, you will not fail to follow the bearer immediately to a convenient place, where you shall be met by. Quiverwit. Whether I was enervated by the love and favor of Narcissa, or awed by the superior station of my antagonist, I know not, but I never had less inclination to fight than at this time. However, finding there was a necessity for vindicating the reputation of my mistress, as well as for asserting my own honor, I forthwith rose, and, dressing in a hurry, put on my sword, bade Strap attend me, and set out with my conductor, cursing my bad fortune all the way, for having been observed in my return from my angel. For so I interpreted his lordship's discovery. When I came within sight of my rival, his lackey told me he had orders to stop, upon which I commanded Strap to halt also, while I walked forward, resolving, if possible, to come to an explanation with my challenger before we should come to battle. Nor was an opportunity wanting, for I no sooner approached than he asked, with a stern countenance, what business I had in Mr. Topal's garden so early in the morning. I don't know, my lord, said I, how to answer a question put to me with such magisterial haughtiness. If your lordship will please to expostulate calmly, you will have no cause to repent of your condescension, otherwise I am not to be intimated into any confession. There is no room for denial, answered he. I saw you come out with my own eyes. Did any other see me? Said I neither know nor care, said he. I want no other evidence than that of my own senses. Pleased to hear that the suspicion was confined to him alone, I endeavored to appease his jealousy by owning an intrigue with the waiting maid. But he had too much discernment to be so easily imposed upon, and told me there was only one way to convince him of the truth of what I alleged, which was no other than renouncing all claim to Narcissa upon oath, and promising, upon honor, never to speak to her for the future. Exasperated at this proposal, I unsheathed my sword, saying, Heavens! What title have you or any man on earth to impose such terms on me? He did the same, and making towards me with a contracted brow, said I was a villain and had dishonored Narcissa. He's a villain, I replied in a transport of fury, who brands me with that imputation. She is 1,000 times more chaste than the mother that bore you, and I will assert her honor with my heart's blood. So saying, I rushed upon him with more eagerness than address, and, endeavoring to get within his point, received a wound in my neck, which redoubled my rage. He excelled me in temper as well as in skill, by which means he parried my thrusts with great calmness, until I had almost exhausted my spirits, and when he perceived me beginning to flag, attacked me fiercely in his turn. Finding himself, however, better opposed than he expected, he resolved to follow his lunge and close with me. Accordingly, his sword entered my waistcoat, on the side of the breastbone, and, running up between my shirt and skin, appeared over my left shoulder. I imagined that his weapon had perforated my lungs, and of consequence that the wound was mortal. Therefore, determined not to die unrevenged, I seized his shell, which was close to my breast, before he could disentangle his point, and keeping it fast with my left hand, shortened my own sword with my right, intending to run him through the heart. But he received the thrust in the left arm, which penetrated up to the shoulder blade. Disappointed at this expectation, and afraid still that death would frustrate my revenge, I grappled with him, and being much the stronger, threw him upon the ground, where I wrested his sword out of his hand. And so great was my confusion, that instead of turning the point upon him, struck out 3 of his 40th with the hilt. In the meantime, our servants, seeing us fall, ran up to separate and assist us. But before their approach I was upon my feet, and had discovered that my supposed mortal wound was only a slight scratch. The knowledge of my own safety disarmed me of a good deal of my resentment, and I began to inquire with some concern into the situation of my antagonist, who remained on the ground bleeding plentifully at his mouth and arm. I helped his footman to raise him, and having bound up his wound with my handkerchief, assured it was not dangerous. I likewise restored his sword, and offered to support him to his house. He thanked me with an air of sullen dignity, and whispering that I should hear from him soon, went away, leaning on his servant's shoulder. I was surprised at this promise, which I construed into a threat, and resolved, if ever he should call me out again, to use whatever advantage fortune might give me over him in another manner. In the meantime, I had leisure to take notice of Strap, who seemed quite stupefied with horror. I comforted him with an assurance that I had received no damage, and explained the nature of this affair as we walked homeward. By the time I had got into my apartment, I found the wound in my neck stiff and uneasy, and a good deal of clotted blood ran down upon my shirt, upon which I pulled off my coat and waistcoat and unbuttoned my collar, that I might dress it with more ease. My friend no sooner perceived my shirt quite dyed with blood, than imagining I had got at least 20,000 wounds, he cried, "Oh, Jesus!" and fell flat on the floor. I stopped the bleeding with a little dry lint, and applying a plaster over it, cleaned myself from the gore, shifted, and dressed, while he lay senseless at my feet, so that when he recovered, and saw me perfectly well, he could scarce believe his own eyes. Now that the danger was past, I was very well pleased with what had happened, hoping that it would soon become known, and consequently dignify my character not a little in this place. I was also proud of having shown myself, in some shape, worthy of the love of Narcissa, who, I was persuaded, would not think the worse of me for what I had done. Chapter 60. I am visited by freemen, with whom I appear in public and am caressed, am sent for by Lord Quiverwit, whose presence I quit flung. Narcissa is carried off by her brother. I intend to pursue him, and am dissuaded by my friend, engage in play, and lose all my money, set out for London, try my fortune at the gaming table without success, receive a letter from Narcissa, bilk my tailor. While I entertained myself with these reflections, the news of the duel, being communicated by some unknown channel, spread all over the town. I was visited by Freeman, who testified his surprise at finding me, for it was told that Lord Quiverwit being dead of his wounds, I had absconded in order to avoid the cognizance of the law. I asked if people guessed the occasion of the quarrel, and, understanding it was attributed to his lordship's resentment of my reply in the long room, confirmed that conjecture, glad to find Narcissa unsuspected. My friend, after I had assured him that my antagonist was in no danger, wished me joy of the event, than which, he said, nothing could happen more opportunely to support the idea he had given of my character to his friends, among whom he had been very assiduous in my behalf. On the strength of this assurance, I went with him to the coffee house, where I was saluted by a great many of those very persons who had shunned me the preceding day, and I found everybody making merry with the story of Melinda's French gallant. While I remained in this place, I received a message from Lord Quiverwit, desiring, if I were not engaged, to see me at his house. Thither I immediately repaired, and was conducted to an apartment where I was received by his lordship in bed. When we were left by ourselves, he thanked me in very polite terms for having used the advantage fortune had given me over him with such moderation, and asked pardon for any offense his resentment might have prompted him to commit. "I would willingly," said he, "make you my friend, but as it is impossible for me to divest myself of my passion for Narcissa, I am too well convinced of your sentiments to think we shall ever agree on that subject. I took the liberty, therefore, of sending for you in order to own candidly that I cannot help opposing your success with that young lady, though at the same time I promise to regulate my opposition by the dictates of justice and honor. This, however, I think proper to advertise you of, that she has no independent fortune. And, if you should even succeed in your addresses, you will have the mortification to see her reduced to indigence, unless you have wherewithal to support her. And I am credibly informed of your incapacity that way. Nay, I will confess, that, urged by this consideration, I have actually sent notice to her brother of the progress I suspect you have made in her affection, and desired him to take his precautions accordingly." Alarmed and provoked at this information, I told his lordship that I did not see how he could reconcile that piece of conduct with his profession of open dealing, and flung away from him in a passion. As I walked homeward, in hope of hearing from my mistress as usual by means of Miss Williams, I was surprised with the waving of a handkerchief from the window of a coach and six that passed by me at full speed. And upon further observation, I saw a servant on horseback riding after it, who, I knew by his livery, belonged to the squire. Thunderstruck with this discovery, the knowledge of my misfortune rushed all at once upon my reflection. I guessed immediately that the signal was made by the dear hand of Narcissa, who, being hurried away in consequence of Lord Quiverwit's message to her brother, had no other method of relating her distress and imploring my assistance. Frantic with this conjecture, I ran to my lodgings, snatched my pistols, and ordered Strap to get post-horses, with such incoherence of speech and disorder, that the poor valet, terrified with the suspicion of another duel, instead of providing what I desired, went forthwith to Freeman, who, being informed of my behavior, came straight to my apartment, and conjured me so pathetically to make him acquainted with the cause of my uneasiness, that I could not refuse telling him my happiness was fled with Narcissa, and that I must retrieve her or perish. He represented the madness of such an undertaking, and endeavored to divert me from it with great strength of friendship and reason. But all his arguments would have been ineffectual, had he not put me in mind of the dependence I ought to have on the love of Narcissa, and the attachment of her maid, who could not fail of finding opportunities to advertise me of their situation, and at the same time demonstrated the injury my charmer's reputation must suffer from my precipitate retreat. I was convinced and composed by these considerations. I appeared in public with an air of tranquillity, was well received by the best company in town, and, my misfortune taking air, condoled accordingly. While I had the satisfaction of seeing Melinda so universally discountenanced that she was fain to return to London, in order to avoid the scoffs and censure of the ladies at Bath. But though the hope of hearing from the darling of my soul supported my spirits a little while, I began to be very uneasy, when, at the end of several weeks, I found that expectation disappointed. In short, melancholy and despondence took possession of my soul. And, repining at that providence which, by acting the stepmother towards me, kept me from the fruition of my wishes, I determined, in a fit of despair, to risk all I had at the gaming table, with a view of acquiring a fortune sufficient to render me independent for life, or of plunging myself into such a state of misery as would effectually crush every ambitious hope that now tortured my imagination. Actuated by this fatal resolution, I engaged in play, and after some turns of fortune found myself, at the end of 3 days, worth £1,000. But it was not my intention to stop there, for which cause I kept Strap ignorant of my success, and continued my career until I was reduced to 5 guineas, which I would have hazarded also, had I not been ashamed to fall from a bet of £200 to such a petty sum. Having thus executed my scheme, I went home, amazed to find myself so much at ease, and informed my friend Strap of my mischance with such calmness, that he, imagining I joked, affected to receive the tidings with great equanimity. But both he and I found ourselves mistaken very soon. I had misinterpreted my own stupidity into deliberate resignation, and he had reason to believe me in earnest when he saw me next morning agitated with the most violent despair, which he endeavored to alleviate with all the consolation in his power. In one of my lucid intervals, however, I charged him to take a place in the stage-coach for London, and, in the meantime, paid my debts in Bath, which amounted to 30 shillings only. Without taking leave of my friends, I embarked, Strap having the good fortune to find a return horse, and arrived in town without having met with anything remarkable on the road. While we crossed Bagshot Heath, I was seized with a sort of inclination to retrieve my fortune, by laying passengers under contribution in some such place. My thoughts were so circumstanced at this time, that I should have digested the crime of robbery, so righteously had I concerted my plan, and ventured my life in the execution, had I not been deterred by reflecting upon the infamy that attends detection. The apartment I formerly lived in being unengaged, I took possession of it, and next day went in quest of Banter, who received me with open arms, in expectation of having his bond discharged to his liking. But when he understood what had happened, his countenance changed of a sudden, and he told me, with a dryness of displeasure peculiar to himself, that, if he were in my place, he would put it out of fortune's power to play him such another trick, and be avenged of his own indiscretion at once. When I desired him to explain his meaning, he pointed to his neck, raised himself on his tiptoes, and was going away without any further ceremony, when I put him in mind of my indigence, and demanded the 5 guineas I had formerly lent him. 5 guineas, cried he. Zounds, had you acted with common prudence, you might have had 20,000 in your pocket by this time. I depended upon 500 from you, as much as if I had had notes for it in the bank, and by all the rules of equity, you are indebted to me for that sum. I was neither pleased nor convinced by this computation, and insisted on my right with such determined obstinacy, that he was fain to alter his tone, and appease my clamor by assuring me that he was not master of 5 shillings. Society in distress generally promotes good understanding among people. From being a dun eye descended to be a client, and asked his advice about repairing my losses. He counselled me to have recourse again to the gaming table, where I succeeded so well before, and put myself in a condition by selling my watch. I followed his directions, and having accommodated him with a few pieces, went to the place, where I lost every shilling. Then I returned to my lodgings full of desperate resolution, and having made Strap acquainted with my fate, ordered him to pawn my sword immediately, that I might be enabled to make another effort. This affectionate creature no sooner understood my purpose, than, seized with insupportable sorrow at the prospect of my misery, he burst into tears, and asked what I proposed to do after the small sum he could raise on the sword should be spent. On my own account, said he, I am quite unconcerned, for while God spares me health and these 10 fingers, I can earn a comfortable subsistence anywhere. But what must become of you, who have less humility to stoop and more appetites to gratify? Here I interrupted him, by saying, with a gloomy aspect, I should never want a resource while I had a loaded pistol in possession. Stupefied with horror at this dreadful insinuation, he stood mute for some time and then broke out into, God of his infinite mercy, enable you to withstand that temptation of the devil. Consider your immortal soul, there's no repentance in the grave. O Lord, that we ever should have come to this. Are we not enjoined to resign ourselves to the will of heaven? Where is your patience? Durum patientia frango, you are but a young man, there may be many good things in store for you. Accidit in puncto quo non speratur in anno. Remember your uncle, Mr. Bowling. Perhaps he is now on his voyage homeward, pleasing himself with the hopes of seeing and relieving you. Nay, peradventure, he has already arrived, for the ship was expected about this time. A ray of hope shot athwart my soul at this suggestion. I thanked my friend for this seasonable recollection, and, after having promised to take no resolution till his return, dismissed him to Wapping for intelligence. In his absence, I was visited by Banter, who, being informed of my bad luck at play, told me that fortune would probably be one day weary of persecuting me. In the meantime, said he, here's a letter for you, which I received just now enclosed in one from Freeman. I snatched it with eagerness, and knowing the superscription to be of Narcissa's handwriting, kissed it with transport, and having opened it, read. It is with great difficulty that I have stolen, from the observation of those spies who are set over me, this opportunity of telling you that I was suddenly carried away from Bath by my brother, who was informed of our correspondence by Lord Quiverwit, whom, I since understand, you have wounded in a duel on my account. As I am fully convinced of your honor and love, I hope I shall never hear of such desperate proofs of either for the future. I am so strictly watched that it will be impossible for you to see me, until my brother's suspicion shall abate, or heaven contrive some other unforeseen event in our behalf. In the meantime, you may depend on the constancy and affection of your own Narcissa. P.S. Miss Williams, who is my fellow prisoner, desires to be remembered to you. We are both in good health, and only in pain for you, especially as it will be impracticable for you to convey any message or letter to the place of our confinement. For which reason pray desist from the attempt, that, by miscarrying, might prolong our captivity. And this kind letter afforded me great consolation. I communicated it to Banter, and, at the same time, showed him her picture. He approved of her beauty and good sense, and could not help owning that my neglect of Miss Snapper was excusable when such a fine creature engrossed my attention. I began to be reconciled to my fate, and imagined that, if I could contrive means of subsisting until my uncle should arrive, in case he were not already at home, he would enable me to do something effectual in behalf of my love and fortune. I therefore consulted Banter about a present supply, who no sooner understood that I had credit with a tailor than he advised me to take off 2 or 3 suits of rich clothes and convert them into cash by selling them at half price to a salesman in Monmouth Street. I was startled at this proposal, which I thought savored a little of fraud. He rendered it palatable by observing that, in a few months, I might be in a condition to do everybody justice, and, in the meantime, I was acquitted by the honesty of my intention. I suffered myself to be persuaded by his salvo, by which my necessity, rather than my judgment, was convinced. And when I found there were no accounts of the ship in which my uncle embarked, actually put the scheme in practice, and raised by it 25 guineas, paying him for his advice with the old 5. Chapter 61. I am arrested, carried to the Marshalsea, find my old acquaintance Bo Jackson in that jail. He informs me of his adventures. Strap arrives, and with difficulty is comforted. Jackson introduces me to a poet. I admire his conversation and capacity, am deeply affected with my misfortune. Strap hires himself as a journeyman barber. But this expedient was in a few weeks followed with a consequence I did not foresee. A player, having purchased one of the suits that were exposed to sale, appeared in it on the stage one night, while my tailor unfortunately happened to be present. He knew it immediately, and inquiring minutely into the affair, discovered my whole contrivance, upon which he came into my lodgings, and telling me that he was very much straitened for want of money, presented his bill, which amounted to £50. Surprised at which unexpected address, I affected to treat him cavalierly, swore some oaths, asked if he doubted my honor, and telling him I should take care whom I dealt with for the future, bade him come again in 3 days. He obeyed me punctually, demanded his money, and finding himself amused with bare promises, arrested me that very day in the street. I was not much shocked at this adventure, which indeed put an end to a state of horrible expectation. But I refused to go to a sponging house, where I heard there was nothing but the most flagrant imposition. And, a coach being called, was carried to the Marshalsea, attended by a bailiff and his follower, who were very much disappointed and chagrined at my resolution. The turnkey, guessing from my appearance that I had money in my pocket, received me with the repetition of the Latin word depone, and gave me to understand that I must pay beforehand for the apartment I should choose to dwell in. I desired to see his conveniences, and hired a small paltry bedchamber for £1 a week, which, in any other place, would not have let for half the money. Having taken possession of this dismal habitation, I sent for Strap, and my thoughts were busied in collecting matter of consolation to that faithful squire, when somebody knocked at my door, which I no sooner opened than a young fellow entered in very shabby clothes and marvelous foul linen. After a low bow, he called me by name, and asked if I had forgotten him. His voice assisted me in recollecting his person, whom I soon recognized to be my old acquaintance, Jackson, of whom mention is made in the first part of my memoirs. I saluted him cordially, expressed my satisfaction at finding him alive, and condoled him on his present situation, which, however, did not seem to affect him much, for he laughed very heartily at the occasion of our meeting so unexpectedly in this place. Our mutual compliments being passed, I inquired about his amour with the lady of fortune, which seemed to be so near a happy conclusion when I had the pleasure of seeing him last. And, after an immoderate fit of laughter, he gave me to understand that he had been egregiously bit in that affair. "You must know," said he, "that a few days after our adventure with the bawd and her chaise I found means to be married to that same blue lady you speak of, and passed the night with her at her lodgings, so much to her satisfaction, that early in the morning, after a good deal of snivelling and sobbing, she owned that, far from being an heiress of great fortune, she was no other than a common woman of the town, who had decoyed me into matrimony, in order to enjoy the privilege of a femme couverte. And that, unless I made my escape immediately, I should be arrested for a debt of her contracting, by bailiffs employed and instructed for that purpose. Startled at this intimation, I rose in a twinkling, and taking leave of my spouse with several hearty dams, got safe into the verge of the court, where I kept snug, until I was appointed surgeon's mate of a man-o'-war at Portsmouth. For which place I set out on Sunday, went on board of my ship, in which I sailed to the Straits, where I had the good fortune to be made surgeon of a sloop that came home a few months after, and was put out of commission. Whereupon I came to London, imagining myself forgotten and freed from my wife and her creditors, but had not been in town a week, before I was arrested for a debt of hers, amounting to £20, and brought to this place, where I have been fixed by another action since that time. However, you know my disposition, I defy care and anxiety, and being on the half-pay list, make shift to live here tolerably easy. I congratulated him on his philosophy, and remembering that I was in his debt, repaid the money he formerly lent me, which, I believe, was far from being unseasonable. I then inquired about the economy of the place, which he explained to my satisfaction, and after we had agreed to mess together, he was just now going to give orders for dinner when Strap arrived. I never in my life saw sorrow so extravagantly expressed in any countenance as in that of my honest friend, which was, indeed, particularly adapted by nature for such impressions. When we were left by ourselves, I communicated to him my disaster and endeavored to console him with the same arguments he had formerly used to me, withal representing the fair chance I had of being relieved in a short time by Mr. Bowling. But his grief was unutterable. He seemed to give attention without listening and wrung his hands in silence, so that I was in a fair way of being infected by his behavior when Jackson returned, and, perceiving the deference I paid to Strap, although in a footman's habit, distributed his crumbs of comfort with such mirth, jollity, and unconcern that the features of the distressed squire relaxed by degrees. He recovered the use of speech, and began to be a little more reconciled to this lamentable event. We dined together on boiled beef and greens, brought from a cook's shop in the neighborhood, and although this meal was served up in a manner little corresponding with the sphere of life in which I had lately lived, I made a virtue of necessity, ate with good appetite, and treated my friends with a bottle of wine, which had the desired effect of increasing the good humor of my fellow prisoner, and exhilarating the spirits of Strap, who now talked cavalierly of my misfortune. After dinner, Jackson left us to our private affairs, when I desired my friend to pack up all our things and carry them to some cheap lodgings he should choose for himself in the neighborhood of the Marshalsea, after he had discharged my lodgings, for which purpose I gave him money. I likewise recommended to him the keeping my misfortune secret, and saying to my landlord, or any other who should inquire for me, that I was gone into the country for a few weeks. At the same time, I laid strong injunctions upon him to call every second day upon Banter, in case he should receive any letter for me from Narcissa, by the channel of Freeman, and by all means to leave a direction for himself at my uncle's lodgings in Wapping, by which I might be found when my kinsman should arrive. When he departed to execute these orders, which by the by were punctually performed that very night, I found myself so little seasoned to my situation that I dreaded reflection, and sought shelter from it in the company of the beau, who, promising to regale me with a lecture upon taste, conducted me to the common side, where I saw a number of naked, miserable wretches assembled together. We had not been here many minutes, when a figure appeared wrapped in a dirty rug, tied about his loins with 2 pieces of list, of different colors, knotted together, having a black bushy beard, and his head covered with a huge mass of brown periwig, which seems to have been ravished from the crown of some scarecrow. This apparition, stalking in with great solemnity, made a profound bow to the audience, who signified their approbation by a general response of "How d'ye do, doctor?" He then turned towards us, and honored Jackson with a particular salutation, upon which my friend, in a formal manner, introduced him to me by the name of Mr. Melopoyn. This ceremony being over, he advanced into the middle of the congregation, which crowded around him, and hemming 3 times, to my utter astonishment, pronounced with great significance of voice and gesture, a very elegant and ingenious discourse upon the difference between genius and taste, illustrating his assertions with apt quotations from the best authors, ancient as well as modern. When he had finished his harangue, which lasted a full hour, he bowed again to the spectators, not one of whom I was informed understood so much as a sentence of what he had uttered. They manifested, however, their admiration and esteem by voluntary contributions, which Jackson told me, 1 week with another, amounted to 18 pence. This moderate stipend, together with some small presents that he received for making up differences and deciding causes amongst the prisoners, just enabled him to breathe and walk about in the grotesque figure I have described. I understood also that he was an excellent poet, and had composed a tragedy, which was allowed by everybody who had seen it to be a performance of great merit. That his learning was infinite, his morals unexceptionable, and his modesty invincible. Such a character could not fail of attracting my regard. I longed impatiently to be acquainted with him, and desired Jackson would engage him to spend the evening in my apartment. My request was granted. He favored us with his company, and, in the course of our conversation, perceiving that I had a strong passion for the Bell's letters, acquitted himself so well on that subject, that I expressed a fervent desire of seeing his productions. In this point, too, he gratified my inclination. He promised to bring his tragedy to my room next day, and in the meantime, entertained me with some detached pieces, which gave me a very advantageous idea of his poetical talent. Among other things, I was particularly pleased with some elegies, in imitation of Tibullus, one of which I beg leave to submit to the reader as a specimen of his complexion and capacity. Where now are all my flattering dreams of joy? Monimia, give my soul her wonted rest. Since first thy beauty fixed my roving eye, heart-gnawing cares corrode my pensive breast. Let happy lovers fly where pleasures call. With festive songs beguile the fleeting hour, lead beauty through the mazes of the ball, or press her wanton in love's roseate bower. For me, no more I'll range the empurpled mead, where shepherds pipe and virgins dance around, nor wander through the woodbine's fragrant shade, to hear the music of the grove resound. I'll seek some lonely church or dreary hall, where fancy paints the glimmering taper blue, where damps hang moldering on the ivied wall, and sheeted ghosts drink up the midnight dew. There, leagued with hopeless anguish and despair, while in silence o'er my fate repair. Then, with a long farewell to love and care, to kindred dust my weary limbs consign. Wilt thou, Monimia, shed a gracious tear on the cold grave where all my sorrows rest, strew vernal flowers, applaud my love sincere, and bid the turf lie easy on my breast? I was wonderfully affected with this pathetic complaint, which seemed so well calculated for my own disappointment in love, that I could not help attaching the idea of Narcissa to the name of Monimia, and of forming such melancholy presages of my passion that I could not recover my tranquillity, and was fain to have recourse to the bottle, which prepared me for a profound sleep that I could not otherwise have enjoyed. Whether these impressions invited and introduced a train of other melancholy reflections, or my fortitude was all exhausted in the effort I made against despondence, during the first day of my imprisonment, I cannot determine. But I awoke in the horrors, and found my imagination haunted with such dismal apparitions, that I was ready to despair. And I believe the reader will own, I had no great cause to congratulate myself when I considered my situation. I was interrupted in the midst of these gloomy apprehensions by the arrival of Strap, who contributed not a little to the re-establishment of my peace, by letting me know that he had hired himself as a journeyman barber, by which means he would be able not only to save me a considerable expense, but even make shift to lay up something for my subsistence, after my money should be spent, in case I should not be relieved before. Chapter 62. I read Melopoyn's tragedy and conceive a vast opinion of his genius. He recounts his adventures. While we ate our breakfast together, I made him acquainted with the character and condition of the poet, who came in with his play at that instant, and, imagining we were engaged about business, could not be prevailed upon to sit, but, leaving his performance, went away. My friend's tender heart was melted at the sight of a gentleman and Christian, for he had a great veneration for both these epithets in such misery, and assented with great cheerfulness to a proposal I made of clothing him with our superfluities, a task with which he charged himself, and departed immediately to perform it. He was no sooner gone than I locked my door and sat down to the tragedy, which I read to the end with vast pleasure, not a little amazed at conduct of the managers who had rejected it. The fable, in my opinion, was well chosen and naturally conducted, the incidents interesting, the characters beautifully contrasted, strongly marked, and well supported, the diction poetical, spirited, and correct. The unities of the drama maintained with the most scrupulous exactness, the opening gradual and engaging, the peripeteia surprising, and the catastrophe affecting. In short, I judged it by the laws of Aristotle and Horace, and could find nothing in it exceptionable but a little too much embellishment in some few places, which objection he removed to my satisfaction by a quotation of Aristotle's Poetics, importing that the least interesting parts of a poem ought to be raised and dignified by the charms and energy of diction. I revered his genius, and was seized with an eager curiosity to know the particular events of a fortune so unworthy of his merit. At that instant Strap returned with a bundle of clothes, which I sent with my compliments to Mr. Melopoyn as a small token of my regard, and desired the favor of his company to dinner. He accepted my present and invitation, and in less than half an hour made his appearance in a decent dress, which altered his figure very much to his advantage. I perceived by his countenance that his heart was big with gratitude, and endeavored to prevent his acknowledgments by asking pardon for the liberty I had taken. He made no reply, but with an aspect full of admiration and esteem, bowed to the ground, while the tears gushed from his eyes. Affected with these symptoms of an ingenuous mind, I shifted the conversation, and complimented him on his performance, which I assured him afforded me infinite pleasure. My approbation made him happy. Dinner being served, and Jackson arrived, I begged their permission for Strap to sit at table with us, after having informed them that he was a person to whom I was extremely obliged. They were kind enough to grant that favor, and we ate together with great harmony and satisfaction. Our meal being ended, I expressed my wonder at the little regard Mr. Melopoyn had met with from the world, and signified a desire of hearing how he had been treated by the managers of the playhouses, to whom I understood from Jackson he had offered his tragedy without success. "There is so little entertaining in the incidents of my life," said he, "that I am sure the recital will not recompense your attention. But since you discover an inclination to know them, I understand my duty too well to disappoint your desire." My father, who was a curate in the country, being by the narrowness of his circumstances hindered from maintaining me at the university, took the charge of my education upon himself, and labored with such industry and concern in the undertaking that I had little cause to regret the want of public masters. Being at great pains to consult my natural bias, he discovered in me betimes an inclination for poetry, upon which he recommended to me an intimate acquaintance with the classics, in the cultivation of which he assisted me with a paternal zeal and uncommon erudition. When he thought me sufficiently acquainted with the ancients, he directed my studies to the best modern authors, French and Italian as well as English, and laid a particular injunction upon me make myself master of my mother tongue. About the age of 18, I grew ambitious of undertaking a work of some consequence, and with my father's approbation, actually planned the tragedy you have read. But before I had finished 4 acts, that indulgent parent died, and left my mother and me in very indigent circumstances. A near relation, compassionating our distress, took us into his family, where I brought my fable to a conclusion, and soon after that period my mother quitted this life. When my sorrow for this melancholy event had subsided, I told my kinsman, who was a farmer, that, having paid my last duty to my parent, I had now no attachment to detain me in the country, and therefore was resolved to set out for London, and offer my play to the stage, where I did not doubt of acquiring a large share of fame as well as fortune, in which case I should not be unmindful of my friends and benefactors. My cousin was ravished with the prospect of my felicity, and willingly contributed towards the expense of fitting me out for my expedition. Accordingly, I took a place in the wagon, and arrived in town, where I hired an apartment in a garret, willing to live as frugally as possible, until I should know what I had to expect from the manager, to whom I intended to offer my play. For though I looked upon myself as perfectly secure of a good reception, imagining that a patentee would be as eager to receive as I to present my production, I did not know whether or not he might be pre-engaged in favor of another author, a circumstance that would certainly retard my success. On this consideration, too, I determined to be speedy in my application, and even to wait upon one of the managers the very next day. For this purpose, I inquired my landlord if he knew where either or both of them lived. And he, being curious to know my business, and at the same time appearing to be a very honest, friendly man, a tallow chandler, I made him acquainted with my design, upon which he told me that I went the wrong way to work, that I would not find such easy access to a manager as I imagined, and that if I delivered my performance without proper recommendation, it would be as 1 to 1,000 if ever it would be minded. "Take my advice," said he, "and your business is done. One of the patentees is a good Catholic, as I am, and uses the same father who confesses me. I will make you acquainted with this good priest, who is an excellent scholar, and if he should approve of your play, his recommendation will go a great way in determining Mr. Supple to bring it on the stage." I applauded his expedient, and was introduced to the friar, who, having perused the tragedy, was pleased to signify his approbation, and commended me in particular for having avoided all reflections upon religion. He promised to use all his influence with his son Supple in my behalf, and to inform himself that very day at what time it was proper for me to wait upon him with the piece. He was punctual in performing his engagement, and next morning gave me to understand that he had mentioned my affair to the manager, and that I had nothing more to do than to go to his house any time in the forenoon, and make use of his name, upon which I should find immediate admittance. I took his advice, put my performance in my bosom, and having received directions, went immediately to the house of Mr. Supple, and knocked at the door, which had a wicket in the middle, faced with a network of iron. Through this, a servant, having viewed me for some time, demanded to know my business. I told him my business was with Mr. Supple, and that I came from Mr. O'Varnish. He examined my appearance once more, then went away, returned in a few minutes, and said his master was busy and could not be seen. Although I was a little mortified at my disappointment, I was persuaded that my reception was owing to Mr. Supple's ignorance of my errand, and, that I might meet with no more obstructions of the same kind, I desired Mr. O'Varnish to be my introductor the next time. He complied with my request, and obtained immediate admittance to the manager, who received me with the utmost civility, and promised to read my play with the first convenience. By his own appointment I called again in a fortnight, but he was gone out. I returned in a week after, and the poor gentleman was extremely ill. I renewed my visit in a fortnight after that, and he assured me he had been so much fatigued with business, that he had not been able as yet to read it to an end, but he would take the first opportunity, and, in the meantime, observed that what he had yet seen of it was very entertaining. I comforted myself with this declaration a few weeks longer, at the end of which I appeared again before his wicket, was let in, and found him laid up with the gout. I no sooner entered his chamber than, looking at me with a languishing eye, he said, "Mr. Melopoyn, I'm heartily sorry for an accident that has happened during my illness. You must know that my eldest boy, finding your manuscript upon the table in the dining room, where I used to read it, carried it into the kitchen, and leaving it there, a negligent wench of a cookmaid, mistaking it for waste paper, has expended it but a few leaves in singing fowls upon the spit. But I hope the misfortune is not irreparable, since, no doubt, you have several copies. I protest to you, my good friend, Mr. Random, I was extremely shocked at this information. But the good-natured gentleman seemed to be so much affected with my misfortune, that I suppressed my concern, and told him that, although I had not another copy, I should be able to retrieve the loss by writing another from my memory, which was very tenacious. You cannot imagine how well pleased Mr. Supple was at this assurance. He begged I would set about it immediately, and carefully revolve and recollect every circumstance before I pretended to commit it to paper, that it might be the same individual play that he had perused. Encouraged by this injunction, which plainly demonstrated how much he interested himself in the affair, I tasked my remembrance and industry, and in 3 weeks produced the exact image of the former, which was conveyed to him by my good friend Father O'Varnish, who told me next day that Mr. Supple would revise it superficially in order to judge of its sameness with the other, and then give his final answer. For this examination I allotted a week, and in full confidence of seeing it acted in a little while, demanded an audience of the manager, when that term was expired. But alas, the season had slipped away insensibly. He convinced me that if my play had been put into rehearsal at the time, it could not have been ready for performing until the end of March when the benefit nights came on. Consequently, it would have interfered with the interest of the players, whom it was not my business to disoblige. I was fain to acquiesce in these reasons, which, to be sure, were extremely just, and to reserve my performance for the next season when he hoped I would not be so unlucky. Although it was a grievous disappointment to me, who, by this time, began to want both money and necessaries, having on the strength of my expectation from the theater launched out into some extravagances, by which the sum I brought to town was already almost consumed. Indeed, I ought to be ashamed at this circumstance of my conduct, for my finances were sufficient, with good economy, to have maintained me comfortably a whole year. You will perhaps be amazed when I tell you that, in 6 months, I expended not a farthing less than 10 guineas. But when one considers the temptations to which a young man is exposed in this great city, especially if he be addicted to pleasure, as I am, the wonder will vanish, or at least abate. Nor was the cause of my concern limited to my own situation entirely. I had written an account of my good reception to my kinsman the farmer, and desired him to depend upon me for the money he had kindly accommodated me with about the end of February, which promise I now found myself unable to perform. However, there was no remedy but patience. I applied to my landlord, who was a very good-natured man, candidly owned my distress, and begged his advice in laying down some plan for my subsistence. He readily promised to consult his confessor on this subject, and in the meantime told me I was welcome to lodge and board with him until fortune should put it in my power to make restitution. Mr. O'Varnish, being informed of my necessity, offered to introduce me to the author of a weekly paper, who, he did not doubt, would employ me in that way, provided he should find me duly qualified. But upon inquiry, I understood that this journal was calculated to foment divisions in the Commonwealth, and therefore I desired to be excused from engaging in it. He then proposed that I should write something in the poetical way, which I might dispose of to a bookseller for a pretty sum of ready money, and, perhaps, establish my own character into the bargain. This event would infallibly procure friends, and my tragedy would appear next season to the best advantage, by being supported both by interest and reputation. I was charmed with this prospect, and having heard what friends Mr. Pope acquired by his pastorals, set about a work of that kind, and in less than 6 weeks composed as many eclogues, which I forthwith offered to an eminent bookseller, who desired me to leave them for his perusal, and he would give an answer in 2 days. At the end of that time, I went to him when he returned the poems, telling me they would not answer his purpose, and sweetened his refusal by saying there were some good clever lines in them. Not a little dejected at this rebuff, which I learned from Mr. O'Varnish was owing to the opinion of another author whom this bookseller always consulted on these occasions, I applied to another person of the same profession, who told me the town was cloyed with pastorals, and advised me, if I intended to profit by my talents, to write something satirical or luscious, such as the buttonhole, shocky and towner, the leaky vessel, etc. And yet this was a man in years who wore a reverend periwig, looked like a senator, and went regularly to church. Be that as it will, I scorned to prostitute my pen in the manner proposed, and carried my papers to a third, who assured me that poetry was entirely out of his way, and asked me if I had got never a piece of secret history thrown into a series of letters or a volume of adventures, such as those of Robinson Crusoe and Colonel Jack, or a collection of conundrums, wherewith to entertain the plantations. Being quite unfurnished for this dealer, I had recourse to another with as little success, and I verily believe was rejected by the whole trade. I was afterwards persuaded to offer myself as a translator, and accordingly repaired to a person who was said to entertain numbers of that class in his pay. He assured me he had already a great deal of that work on his hands, which he did not know what to do with, observed that translations were a mere drug, that branch of literature being overstocked with an inundation of authors from North Britain, and asked what I would expect per sheet for rendering the Latin classics into English. That I might not make myself too cheap, I determined to set a high price upon my qualifications and demanded half a guinea for every translated sheet. "Half a guinea," cried he, staring at me, then paused a little and said he had no occasion for my service at present. I found my error, and resolving to make amends, fell 1/2 in my demand, upon which he stared at me and told me his hands were full. I attempted others without finding employment, and was actually reduced to a very uncomfortable prospect when I bethought myself of offering my talents to the printers of halfpenny ballads and other such occasional essays, as are hawked about the streets. With this in view, I applied to one of the most noted and vociferous of this tribe, who directed me to a person whom I found entertaining a whole crowd of them with gin, bread, and cheese. He carried me into a little back parlor, very neatly furnished, where I signified my desire of being enrolled among his writers, and was asked what kind of composition I professed. Understanding that my inclination leaned towards poetry, he expressed his satisfaction, telling me one of his poets had lost his senses and was confined in Bedlam, and the other was become dozed with drinking drams, so that he had not done anything tolerable these many weeks. When I proposed that we should enter into terms of agreement, he gave me to understand that his bargains were always conditional, and his authors paid in proportion to the sale of their works. Having therefore settled these conditions, which, I do assure you, were not very advantageous to me, he assigned me a subject for a ballad, which was to be finished in 2 hours, and I retired to my garret in order to perform his injunction. As the theme happened to suit my fancy, I completed a pretty sort of an ode within the time prescribed, and brought it to him, big with hope of profit and applause. He read it in a twinkling, and to my utter astonishment told me it would not do. Though indeed he owned I wrote a good hand, and spelled very well, but my language was too high-flown, and of consequence not at all adapted to the capacity and taste of his customers. I promised to rectify that mistake, and in half an hour humbled my style to the comprehension of vulgar readers. He approved of the alteration, and gave me some hopes of succeeding in time, though he observed that my performance was very deficient in the quaintness of expression that pleases the multitude. However, to encourage me, he ventured the expense of printing and paper, and, if I remember aright, my share of the sale amounted to 4 halfpenny. From that day, I studied the Grub Street manner with great diligence, and at length became such a proficient that my works were in great request among the most polite of the chairmen, draymen, hackney coachmen, footmen, and servant maids. Nay, I have enjoyed the pleasure of seeing my productions adorned with cuts, pasted upon the walls as ornaments in beer cellars and cobblers' stalls, and have actually heard them sung in clubs of substantial tradesmen. But empty praise, you know, my dear friend, will not supply the cravings of nature. I found myself in danger of starving in the midst of all my fame, for of 10 songs I composed, it was well if 2 had the good fortune to please. For this reason I turned my thoughts to prose, and during a tract of gloomy weather published an apparition, on the substance of which I subsisted very comfortably a whole month. I have made many a good meal upon a monster. A rape has often afforded me great satisfaction, but a murder, well timed, was my never-failing resource. What then? I was almost a slave to my employers, who expected to be furnished at a minute's warning with prose and verse, just as they thought the circumstances of the times required, whether the inclination was absent or present. Upon my sincerity, Mr. Random, I have been so much pestered and besieged by those children of clamor, that life became a burden to me. Chapter 63. The continuation and conclusion of Mr. Melopoyn's story. I made shift, notwithstanding, to maintain myself till the beginning of next winter, when I renewed my addresses to my friend Mr. Supple, and was most graciously received. "I have been thinking of your affair, Mr. Melopoyn," said he, "and am determined to show how far I have your interest at heart, by introducing you to a young nobleman of my acquaintance, who is remarkable for his fine taste in dramatic writings, and is besides a man of such influence that, if once he should approve of your play, his patronage will support it against all the efforts of envy and ignorance. For, I do assure you, that merit alone will not bring success. I have already spoken of your performance to Lord Rattle, and if you will call at my house in a day or two, you shall have a letter of introduction to his lordship." I was sensibly touched with this mark of Mr. Supple's friendship, and looking upon my affair as already done, went home and imparted my good fortune to my landlord, who, to render my appearance more acceptable to my patron, procured a suit of new clothes for me on his own credit. Not to trouble you with idle particulars, I carried my tragedy to his lordship's lodgings, and sent it up along with Mr. Supple's letter by one of his servants, who desired me, by his lord's order, to return in a week. I did so, and was admitted to his lordship, who received me very courteously, told me he had perused my play, which he thought, on the whole, was the best coup d'essai he had ever seen, but that he had marked some places in the margin, which he imagined might be altered for the better. I was transported with this reception, and promised, with many acknowledgments of his lordship's generosity, to be governed solely by his advice and direction. "Well then," said he, "write another fair copy with the alterations I have proposed, and bring it to me as soon as possible, for I am resolved to have it brought on the stage this winter." You may be sure I set about this task with alacrity, and although I found his lordship's remarks much more numerous and of less importance than I expected, I thought it was not my interest to dispute upon trifles with my patron, therefore new modelled it according to his desire in less than a month. When I waited upon him with the manuscript, I found one of the actors at breakfast with his lordship, who immediately introduced him to my acquaintance, and desired him to read a scene of my play. This task he performed very much to my satisfaction, with regard to emphasis and pronunciation, but he signified his disgust at several words in every page, which I presuming to defend, Lord Rattle told me, with a peremptory look, I must not pretend to dispute with him, who had been a player these 20 years, and understood the economy of the stage better than any man living. I was forced to submit, and his lordship proposed the same actor should read the whole play in the evening, before some gentleman of his acquaintance, whom he would convene to his lodgings for that purpose. I was present at the reading, and I protest to you, my dear friend, I never underwent such a severe trial in the whole course of my life at that juncture. For although the player might be a very honest man and a good performer, he was excessively illiterate and assuming, and made 1,000 frivolous objections, which I was not permitted to answer. However, the piece was very much applauded on the whole. The gentlemen present, who, I understood, were men of fortune, promised to countenance and support it as much as they could, and Lord Rattle, assuring me that he would act the part of a careful nurse to it, desired me to carry it home, and alter it immediately according to their remarks. I was fain to acquiesce in his determination, and fulfilled his injunctions with all the expedition in my power. But, before I could present the new copy, my good friend Mr. Supple had disposed of his property and patent to one Mr. Brayer, so that fresh interest was to be made with the new manager. This task Lord Rattle undertook, having some acquaintance with him, and recommended my performance so strongly that it was received. I looked upon myself now as upon the eve of reaping the fruits of all my labor. I waited a few days in expectation of its being put in rehearsal, and wondering at the delay, applied to my worthy patron, who excused Mr. Brayer on account of the multiplicity of business in which he was involved, and bade me beware of teasing the patentee. I treasured up this caution, and exerted my particular 3 weeks longer, at the end of which his lordship gave me to understand that Mr. Brayer had read my play, and owned it had indubitable merit. But, as he had long been pre-engaged to another author, he could not possibly represent it that season, though, if I would reserve it for the next, and in the interim make such alterations as he had proposed by observations on the margin, I might depend upon his compliance. Thunderstruck at this disappointment, I could not, for some minutes, utter one syllable. At length, however, I complained bitterly of the manager's insincerity in amusing me so long, when he knew from the beginning that he could not gratify my desire. But his lordship reprimanded me for my freedom, said Mr. Brayer was a man of honor, and imputed his behavior with respect to me nothing else but forgetfulness. And indeed, I have had some reason, since that time, to be convinced of his bad memory. For, in spite of appearances, I will not allow myself to interpret his conduct in any other way. Lord Rattle, observing me very much affected with my disappointment, offered his interest to bring on my play at the other house, which I, eagerly accepting, he forthwith wrote a letter of recommendation to Mr. Bellower, actor and prime minister to Mr. Vandal, proprietor of that theatre, and desired me to deliver it with my tragedy, without loss of time. Accordingly, I hastened to his house, where after having waited a whole hour in the lobby, I was admitted to his presence, and my performance received with great state. He told me he was extremely busy at present, but he would peruse it as soon as possible, and bade me to call again in a week. I took my leave, not a little astonished at the pert and supercilious behavior of this stage player, who had not treated me with good manners, and began to think the dignity of a poet greatly impaired since the days of Euripides and Sophocles. But all this was nothing in comparison of what I have since observed. Well, Mr. Random, I went back at the appointed time, and was told that Mr. Bellower was engaged and could not see me. I repeated my visit a few days after, and having waited a considerable time was favored with an audience, during which he said he had not as yet read my play. Nettled at this usage, I could contain myself no longer, but telling him I imagined he would have paid more deference to Lord Rattle's recommendation, demanded my manuscript with some expression of resentment. "I," said he in a theatrical tone, "with all my heart." Then pulling out the drawer of the bureau at which he sat, he took out a bundle and threw it upon a table that was near him, pronouncing the word, "There," with great disdain. I took it up, and perceiving with some surprise that it was a comedy, told him it did not belong to me, upon which he offered another which I also disclaimed. A third was produced, and rejected for the same reason. At length he pulled out a whole bundle, and spread them before me, saying, "There are 7, take which you please, or take them all." I singled out my own, and went away, struck dumb with admiration at what I had seen, not so much on account of his insolence, as of the number of new plays which from this circumstance I concluded were yearly offered to the stage. You may be sure I did not fail to carry my complaint to my patron, who did not receive it with all the indignation I expected, but taxed me with precipitation, and told me I must lay my account with bearing with the humors of the players if I intended to write for the stage. "There is now no other remedy," he said, "but to keep it till the next season for Mr. Brayer, and alter it at your leisure, in the summer, according to his directions." I was now reduced to a terrible alternative, either to quit all hopes of my tragedy, from which I had all along promised myself a large share of fortune and reputation, or to encounter 8 long months of adversity in preparing for and expecting its appearance. This last penance, painful as it was, seemed most eligible to my reflection at that time, and therefore I resolved to undergo it. Why should I tire you with particulars of my consequence? I wrestled with extreme poverty until the time of my probation was expired, and went to my Lord Rattle in order to remind him of my affair, when I understood, to my great concern, that his lordship was just on the point of going abroad, and which was still more unfortunate for me, Mr. Brayer had gone into the country, so that my generous patron had it not in his power to introduce me personally, as he intended. However, he wrote a very strong letter to the manager in my favor, and put him in mind of the promise he had made in behalf of my play. As soon as I was certified of Brayer's return, I went to his house with this letter, but was told he was gone out. I called again next day early in the morning, received the same answer, and was desired to leave my name and business. I did so, and returned the day after, when the servant still affirmed that his master was gone abroad, though I perceived him, as I retired, observing me through a window. Incensed at this discovery, I went to a coffee-house hard by, and, enclosing his lordship's letter in one from myself, demanded a categorical answer. I sent it to his house by a porter, who returned in a few minutes, and told me Mr. Brayer would be glad to see me at that instant. I obeyed the summons and was received with such profusion of compliments and apologies that my resentment immediately subsided, and I was even in pain for the concern which this holiest man showed at the mistake of his servant, who, it seems, had been ordered to deny him to everybody but me. He expressed the utmost veneration for his good and noble friend, Lord Rattle, whom he should always be proud to serve, promised to peruse the play with all dispatch and give me a meeting upon it, and, as a testimony of his esteem, made me a present of a general order for the season, by which I should be admitted to any part of the theatre. This was a very agreeable compliment to me, whose greatest pleasure consisted in seeing dramatic performances, and you need not doubt that I often availed myself of my privilege. As I had an opportunity of being behind the scenes when I pleased, I frequently conversed with Mr. Brayer about my play, and asked when he meant to put it into rehearsal. But he had always so much business upon his hands that it remained with him unopened a considerable while. And I became very uneasy about the season that wasted apace, when I saw in the papers another new play advertised, which had been written, offered, accepted, and rehearsed in the compass of 3 months. You may easily guess how much I was confounded at this event. I own to you that, in the first transports of my anger, I suspected Mr. Brayer of having acted towards me in the most pitiful perfidious manner, and was actually glad at his disappointment in the success of his favorite piece, which, by the strength of art, lingered till the 3rd night, and then died in a deplorable manner. But now that passion has no share in my reflection, I am willing to ascribe his behavior to his want of memory or want of judgment, which, are natural defects that are more worthy of compassion than reproach. About this time, I happened to be in company with a gentlewoman, who, having heard of my tragedy, told me she was well acquainted with the wife of a gentleman who was very well known to a lady, who had great interest with a person who was intimate with Earl Sheerwit, and that, if I pleased, she would use her influence in my behalf. As this nobleman had the character of a Maecenas in the nation, and could stamp a value upon any work by his sole countenance and approbation, I accepted her offer with eagerness, in full confidence of seeing my reputation established, and my wishes fulfilled in a very short time, provided that I should have the good fortune to please his lordship's taste. I withdrew the manuscript from the hands of Mr. Brayer, and committed it to the care of this gentlewoman, who labored so effectually in my interest, that in less than a month it was conveyed to the Earl, and in a few weeks after, I had the satisfaction to hear that he had read and approved it very much. Transported with this piece of intelligence, I flattered myself with the hopes of his interesting himself in its favor. But hearing no more of this matter in 3 whole months, I began, God forgive me, to suspect the veracity of the person who brought me the good tidings, for I thought it impossible that a man of his rank and character, who knew the difficulty of writing a good tragedy and understood the dignity of the work, should read and applaud an essay of this kind without feeling an inclination to befriend the author, whom his countenance alone could raise above dependence. But it was not long before I found my friend very much wronged by my opinion. You must know that the civilities I had received from Lord Rattle, and the desire he manifested to promote the success of my play, encouraged me to write an account of my bad fortune to his lordship, who condescended so far as to desire, by letter, a young squire of a great estate, with whom he was intimate, to espouse my cause, and in particular, make me acquainted with one Mr. Marmozet, a celebrated player, who had lately appeared on the stage with astonishing eclat, and bore such sway in the house where he acted, that the managers durst not refuse anything he recommended. The young gentleman, whom Lord Rattle had employed for this purpose, being diffident of his own interest with Mr. Marmozet, had recourse to a nobleman of his acquaintance, who, at his solicitation, was so good as to introduce me to him. And the conversation turning upon my performance, I was not a little surprised, as well as pleased, to hear that Earl Sheerwit had spoken very much in its praise, and even sent Mr. Marmozet the copy, with a message, expressing a desire that he would act in it next season. Nor was this favorite actor backward in commending the piece, which he mentioned with such expressions of regard that I do not choose to repeat, assuring me that he would appear in it, provided he should be engaged to play at all during the ensuing season. In the meantime, he desired I would give him leave to peruse it in the country, whither he intended to remove next day, that he might have leisure to consider and point out such alterations as might, perhaps, be necessary for its representation, and took my direction that he might communicate by letter the observations he should make. Trusting to these assurances, and the interest which had been made in my behalf, I hugged myself in the expectation of seeing it not only acted, but acted to the greatest advantage, and this I thought could not fail of recompensing me in ample manner for the anxiety and affliction I had undergone. But 6 weeks being elapsed, I did not know how to reconcile Mr. Marmozet's silence with his promise of writing to me in 10 days after he set out for the country. However, I was at last favored with a letter, importing that he had made some remarks on my tragedy, which he would freely impart at meeting, and advised me to put it, without loss of time, into the hands of that manager, who had the best company, as he himself was quite uncertain whether or not he should be engaged that winter. I was a good deal alarmed at this last part of his letter, and advised about it with a friend, who told me it was a plain indication of Mr. Marmozet's desire to get rid of his promise, that his pretended uncertainty about acting next winter was no other than a scandalous evasion. For, to his certain knowledge, he was already engaged, or at least in terms, with Mr. Vandal, and that his design was to disappoint me in favor of a new comedy which he had purchased of the author, and intended to bring upon the stage for his own advantage. In short, my dear sir, this person, who, I must own, is if a sanguine complexion, handled the moral character of Mr. Marmozet with such severity, that I began to suspect him of some particular prejudice, and put myself upon my guard against his insinuations. I ought to crave pardon for this tedious narration of trivial circumstances, which, however interesting they may be to me, must certainly be very dry and insipid to the ear of one unconcerned in the affair. But I understand the meaning of your looks, and will proceed. Well, sir, Mr. Marmozet, upon his return to town, treated me with uncommon complaisance, and invited me to his lodgings, where he proposed to communicate his remarks, which, I confess, were more unfavorable than I expected. But I answered his objections, and, as I thought, brought him over to my opinion, for, on the whole, he signified the highest approbation of the performance. In the course of our dispute, I was not a little surprised to find this poor gentleman's memory so treacherous, as to let him forget what he had said to me, before he went out of town, in regard to Earl Sheerwit's opinion of my play, which he now professed himself ignorant of. And I was extremely mortified at hearing from his own mouth that his interest with Mr. Vandal was so very low as to be insufficient of itself to bring a new piece upon the stage. I then begged his advice, and he counseled me to apply to Earl Sheerwit for a message in my favor to the manager, who would not presume to refuse anything recommended by so great man, and he was so kind as to promise to second this message with all his power. I had immediate recourse to the worthy gentlewoman my friend, already mentioned, who opened the channels of her conveyance with such expedition, that in a few days I had a promise of the message, provided I could assure myself of Mr. Vandal's being unengaged to any other writer. For his lordship did not choose to condescend so far, until he should understand that there was a probability, at least, of succeeding. At the same time that blessed me with this piece of news, I was startled at another, by the same channel of communication, which was that Mr. Marmozet, before he advised me to this application, had informed the Earl that he had read my play and found it altogether unfit for the stage. Though I could not doubt the certainty of this intelligence, I believed there was some inapprehension in the case, and, without taking any notice of it, told Mr. Marmozet the answer had been favored with, and he promised to ask Mr. Vandal the question proposed. I waited upon him in a day or two, when he gave me to understand that Mr. Vandal having professed himself free of all engagements, he had put my play into his hands, and represented it as a piece strongly recommended by Earl Sheerwit, who, he assured him, would honor him with a message in its favor, and he desired me to call for an answer at Mr. Vandal's house in 3 days. I followed his directions, and found the manager, who, being made acquainted with my business, owned that Mr. Marmozet had given him a manuscript play, but denied that he had mentioned Earl Sheerwit's name. When I informed him of the circumstances of the affair, he said he had no engagement with any author, that he would read my tragedy forthwith, and did not believe he should venture to reject it in contradiction to his lordship's opinion, for which he had the utmost veneration, but put it into rehearsal without loss of time. I was so much intoxicated with this encouragement that I overlooked the mysterious conduct of Mr. Marmozet and attended the manager at the time appointed, when, to my infinite confusion, he pronounced my play improper for the stage and rejected it accordingly. As soon as I could recollect myself from the disorder into which this unexpected refusal had thrown me, I expressed a desire of hearing his objections, which were so groundless, indistinct, and unintelligible that I persuaded myself he had not at all perused the piece, but had been prompted by somebody whose lessons he had not rightly retained. However, I have been since informed that the poor man's head, which was not naturally very clear, had been disordered with superstition, and that he labored under the tyranny of a wife and the terrors of hellfire at the same time. Precipitated in this manner from the highest pinnacle of hope to the abyss of despondence, I was ready to sink under the burden of my affliction, and, in the bitterness of my anguish, could not help entertaining some doubts of Mr. Marmozet's integrity, when I recollected and compared the circumstances of his conduct towards me. I was encouraged in this suspicion by being told that my Lord Sheerwit had spoken of his character with great contempt, and, in particular, resented his insolence in opposing his own taste to that of his lordship, concerning my tragedy. While I hesitated between different opinions of the matter, that friend, who, as I told you before, was a little hot-headed, favored me with a visit, and having heard a circumstantial account of the whole affair, could not contain his indignation, but affirmed without ceremony that Mr. Marmozet was the sole occasion of my disappointment, that he acted from first to last with the most perfidious dissimulation, cajoling me with insinuating civilities, while he underhand employed all his art and influence to prejudice the ignorant manager against my performance, that nothing could equal his hypocrisy but his avarice, which engrossed the faculties of his soul so much that he scrupled not to be guilty of the meanest practices to gratify that sordid appetite, that, in consequence of this disposition, he had prostituted his honor in betraying my inexperience, and in undermining the interest of another author of established reputation, who had also offered a tragedy to the stage, which he thought would interfere with the success of the comedy he had bought, and determined to bring on at all events. I was shocked at the description of such a monster, which I could not believe existed in the world, bad as it is, and argued against the asseverations of my friend by demonstrating the bad policy of such behavior, which could not fail of entailing infamy upon the author, and the small temptation that a man of Mr. Marmozet's figure and success could have to consult his interest in such a groveling manner, which must create contempt and abhorrence of him in his patrons, and effectually deprive him of the countenance and protection he now enjoys in such an eminent degree. He pretended to laugh at my simplicity, and asked if I knew for which of his virtues he was so much caressed by the people of fashion. "It is not," said he, "for the qualities of his heart that this little parasite is invited to the tables of dukes and lords, who hire extraordinary cooks for his entertainment. His avarice they see not, his ingratitude they feel not, his hypocrisy accommodates itself to their humors, and is of consequence pleasing. But he is chiefly courted for his buffoonery, and will be admitted into the choicest parties of quality for his talent of mimicking Punch and his wife Joan, when a poet of the most excellent genius is not able to attract the least regard. God forbid, Mr. Random, that I should credit assertions that degrade the dignity of our superiors so much, and represent the poor man as the most abject of all beings. No, I looked upon them as the hyperboles of passion, and though that comedy of which he spoke did actually appear, I dare not doubt the innocence of Mr. Marmozet, who, I am told, is as much as ever in favor with the Earl, a circumstance that surely could not be unless he had vindicated his character to the satisfaction of his lordship. Pray forgive this long digression, and give me the hearing a little longer, for, thank heaven, I am now near the goal. Baffled in all my attempts, I despaired of seeing my play acted, and bethought myself of choosing some employment that might afford a sure, though mean subsistence. But my landlord, to whom I was by this time considerably indebted, and who had laid his account with having his money paid all in a heap from the profits of my third night, could not brook his disappointment, therefore made another effort in my behalf, and, by dint of interest, procured a message from a lady of fashion to Mr. Brayer, who had always professed a great veneration for her, desiring that he would set up my play forthwith, and assuring him that she and all her friends would support it in the performance. To strengthen my interest, she engaged his best actors in my cause, and, in short, exerted herself so much that it was again received, and my hopes began to revive. But Mr. Brayer, honest man, was so much engrossed by business of vast consequence, though to appearance he had nothing at all to do, that he could not find time to read it until the season was pretty far advanced. And read it he must, for notwithstanding his having perused it before, his memory did not retain one circumstance of the matter. At length he favored it with his attention, and having proposed certain alterations, sent his duty to the lady who patronized it, and promised, on his honor, to bring it on next winter, provided these alterations should be made, and the copy delivered to him before the end of April. With an aching heart, I submitted to these conditions, and performed them accordingly. But fortune owed me another unforeseen mortification. Mr. Marmozet, during the summer, became joint patentee with Mr. Brayer, so that when I claimed performance of articles, I was told he could do nothing without the consent of his partner, who was pre-engaged to another author. My condition was rendered desperate by the death of my good friend and landlord, whose executors obtained a judgment against my effects, which they seized, turned me out into the streets naked, friendless, and forlorn. There I was arrested at the suit of my tailor, and thrown into the prison, where I have made shift to live these 5 weeks on the bounty of my fellow prisoners, who, I hope, are not the worse for the instruction and good offices by which I manifest my gratitude. But in spite of all their charitable endeavors, my life was scarce tolerable, until your uncommon benevolence enabled me to enjoy it with comfort. Chapter 64. I am seized with a deep melancholy, and become a sloven, am relieved by my uncle. He prevails upon me to engage with his owners, as a surgeon of the ship which he commands. He makes me a considerable present, entertains Strap as his steward. I take leave of my friends and go on board. The ship arrives in the Downs. I shall not make any reflection on this story, in the course of which the reader must perceive how egregiously the simplicity and milky disposition of this worthy man had been duped and abused by a set of scoundrels, who were so habituated to falsehood and equivocation, that I verily believed they would have found the utmost difficulty in uttering one syllable of truth, though their lives had depended upon their sincerity. Notwithstanding all I had suffered from the knavery and selfishness of mankind, I was amazed and incensed by the base indifference which suffered such uncommon merit as he possessed to languish in obscurity, and struggle with all the miseries of a loathsome jail, and should have blessed the occasion that secluded me from such a perfidious world, had not the remembrance of my amiable Narcissa preserved my attachment to a society of which she constituted a part. The picture of that lovely creature was the constant companion of my solitude, How often did I contemplate the resemblance of those enchanting features that first captivated my heart? How often did I weep over those endearing scenes which her image recalled? And how often did I curse my perfidious fate for having robbed me of the fair original? In vain did my imagination flatter me with schemes of future happiness. Surly reason always interposed, and in a moment overthrew the unsubstantial fabric by chastising the extravagance of my hope and representing my unhappy situation in the right point of view. In vain did I fly for refuge to the amusements of the place and engage in the parties of Jackson at cards, billiards, ninepins, and fives. A train of melancholy thoughts took possession of my soul, which even the conversation of Melopoyn could not divert. I ordered Strap to inquire every day at Banter's lodgings, in expectation of hearing again from my charmer, and my disappointment considerably augmented my chagrin. My affectionate valet was infected with my sorrow, and often sat with me whole hours without speaking, uttering sigh for sigh, and shedding tear for tear. This fellowship increased our distemper. He became incapable of business and was discarded by his master, while I, seeing my money melt away without any certainty of deliverance, and, in short, all my hopes frustrated, grew negligent of life, lost all appetite, and degenerated into such a sloven that during the space of 3 months I was neither washed, shifted, nor shaved. So that my face, rendered meager with abstinence, was obscured with dirt and overshadowed with hair, and my whole appearance squalid and even frightful, when one day Strap brought me notice that there was a man below who wanted to speak with me. Roused at this intelligence, and in full hopes of receiving a letter from the dear object of my love, I ran downstairs with the utmost precipitation, and found to my infinite surprise my generous uncle, Mr. Bowling. Transported at the sight, I sprang forward to embrace him, upon which he started aside with great agility, drew his hanger, and put himself upon his guard, crying, "Avast, brother, avast, sheer off. Yo-ho, you turnkey, why don't you keep a better lookout? Here's one of your crazy prisoners broke from his lashings, I suppose." I could not help laughing heartily at his mistake, but this I soon rectified by my voice, which he instantly recollected, and shook me by the hand with great affection, testifying his concern at seeing me in such a miserable condition. I conducted him to my apartment, where, in presence of Strap, whom I introduced to him as one of my best friends, he gave me to understand that he was just arrived from the coast of Guinea, after having made a pretty successful voyage in which he had acted as mate, until the ship was attacked by a French privateer, that the captain being killed during the engagement, he had taken the command, and was so fortunate as to sink the enemy. After which exploit he fell in with a merchant ship from Martinico, laden with sugar, indigo, and some silver, and by virtue of his letter of marque, attacked, took, and carried her safe into Kinsale in Ireland, where she was condemned as a lawful prize. By which means he had not only got a pretty sum of money, but also acquired the favor of his owners, who had already conferred upon him the command of a large ship, mounted with 29-pounders, ready to sail upon a very advantageous voyage, which he was not at liberty to discover. And he assured me that it was with the greatest difficulty he found me, in consequence of a direction left for him at his lodgings at Wapping. I was rejoiced beyond measure at this account of his good fortune, and, at his desire, recounted all the adventures that had happened to me since we parted. When he understood the particulars of Strap's attachment to me, he squeezed his hand very cordially, and promised to make a man of him. Then, giving me 10 guineas for my present occasion, took a direction for the tailor who arrested me, and went away in order to discharge the debt, telling me at parting that he would soon fetch up all my leeway with a wet sail. I was utterly confounded at this sudden transition, which affected me more than any reverse I had formerly felt, and a crowd of incoherent ideas rushed so impetuously upon my imagination that my reason could neither separate nor connect them. When Strap, whose joy had manifested itself in 1,000 full cries, came into my room with his shaving utensils, and without any previous intimation, began to lather my beard, whistling with great emotion all the while. I started from my reverie, and, being too well acquainted with Strap to trust myself in his hands while he was under such agitation, desired to be excused, sent for another barber, and suffered myself to be trimmed. Having performed the ceremony of ablution, I shifted, and dressing in my gayest apparel, waited for the return of my uncle, who was agreeably surprised at my sudden transformation. This beneficent kinsman had satisfied my creditor and obtained an order for my discharge, so that I was no longer a prisoner. But as I had some reluctance to part with my friends and fellows in distress, I prevailed upon Mr. Bowling to favor us with his company, and invited Mr. Melopoyn and Jackson to spend the evening at my apartment, where I regaled them with a supper, good wine, and the news of my release, on which they heartily congratulated me, notwithstanding the loss of my company, which, they were pleased to say, they should severely feel. As for Jackson, his misfortune made so little impression on himself, and he was altogether so loose, indifferent, and indiscreet, that I could scarce pity his situation. But I had conceived a veneration and friendship for the poet, who was, in all respects, an object much more worthy of compassion and regard. When our guests withdrew, and my uncle had retired with an intention of visiting me next morning, I made up a bundle of some linen and other necessaries, and, bidding Strap carry them to Mr. Melopoyn's lodgings, went thither myself, and pressed it upon his acceptance, with 5 guineas, which, with much difficulty, he received, assuring me at the same time that he should never have it in his power to make satisfaction. I then asked if I could serve him in any other way, to which he answered, "You have already done too much," and, unable to contain the emotions of his soul any longer, burst into tears and wept aloud. Moved at this spectacle, I left him to his repose, and, when my uncle returned in the morning, represented his character in such a favorable light that the honest seaman was affected with his distress, and determined to follow my example in presenting him with 5 pieces more. Upon which, that I might save him some confusion, I advised Mr. Bowling to enclose it in a letter to be delivered by Strap, after we should be gone. This was accordingly done. I took a formal leave of all my acquaintance in the jail, and just as I was about to step into a hackney coach at the gate, Jackson calling me, I returned, and he asked me in a whisper if I could lend him a shilling. His demand being so moderate, and in all likelihood the last he would make upon me, I slipped a guinea into his hand, which he no sooner perceived than he cried, "Oh Jesus, a guinea!" Then laying hold of a button of my coat, broke out into laughter, and when his immoderate fit of convulsion was ended, told me I was an honest fellow, and let me go. The coachman was ordered to drive to Mr. Bowling's lodgings, where, when we arrived, he entered into a serious discourse with me on the subject of my situation, and proposed that I should sail with him in quality of his surgeon, in which case he would put me in a method of getting a fortune in a few years by my own industry, and assured me that I might expect to inherit all that he should die possessed of, provided I should survive him. Though I was penetrated with a sense of his generosity, L was startled at a proposal that offered violence to my love, and signified my sentiments on that head, which he did not seem to relish, but observed that love was the fruit of idleness, that when once I should be employed in business, and my mind engaged in making money, I should be no more troubled with these silly notions, which none but your fair-weathered jacks, who have nothing but their pleasure to mind, ought to entertain. I was piqued at this insinuation, which I looked upon as a reproach, and without giving myself time to deliberate, accepted his offer. He was overjoyed at my compliance, carried me immediately to his chief owner, with whom a bargain was struck, so that then I could not retract with honor, had I been ever so much averse to the agreement. That I might not have time to cool, he bade me draw out a list of medicines for a complement of 500 men, adapted to the distempers of hot climates and sufficient for a voyage of 18 months, and carry it to a certain wholesale apothecary, who would also provide me in 2 well-qualified mates. While I was thus employed, Strap came in, and looked very blank when he understood my resolution. However, after a pause of some minutes, he insisted upon going along with me, and at my desire was made ship's steward by Captain Bowling, who promised to be at the expense of fitting him out, and to lend him £200 to purchase an adventure. When I had delivered my list of medicines, chosen a couple of my own countrymen for mates, and bespoke a set of chirurgical instruments, my uncle told me that by his last voyage he had cleared almost £3,000, 1/3 of which he would immediately make over and put into my hands, that he would procure for me credit to the value of so much more in such goods as would turn to best account in the country to which we were bound, and that, although he looked upon my interest as his own, he would keep the remaining part of his fortune in his own disposal, with a view of preserving his independence and the power of punishing me, in case I should not make a good use of what he had already bestowed. Without troubling the reader with an account of the effect which this surprising generosity had upon my mind, I shall only say that his promises were instantly performed, and an invoice of merchandise proper for the voyage presented to me, that I might purchase the goods and ship them with all expedition. In the midst of this hurry, the remembrance of my charming Narcissa often interposed, and made me the most miserable of all mortals. I was distracted with the thought of being torn from her, perhaps forever. And though the hope of seeing her again might have supported me under the torments of separation, I could not reflect upon the anguish she must feel at parting with me, and the incessant sorrows to which her tender bosom would be exposed during my absence, without being pierced with the deepest affliction. As my imagination was daily and nightly upon the rack to invent some method of mitigating this cruel stroke, or at least of acquitting my love and honor in the opinion of this gentle creature, I at length stumbled upon an expedient, with which the reader will be made acquainted in due time, and, in consequence of my determination, became less uneasy and disturbed. My business being finished, and the ship ready to sail, I resolved to make my last appearance among my acquaintance at the other end of the town, where I had not been since my imprisonment. And as I had, by the advice of my uncle, taken off some very rich clothes for sale, I put on the gayest suit in my possession, and went in a chair to the coffee-house I used to frequent, where I found my friend Banter so confounded at the magnificence of my dress, that, when I made up to him, he gazed at me with a look of astonishment, without being able for some minutes to open his lips. Then pulling me aside by the sleeve, and fixing his eyes on mine, accosted me thus: "Random, where the devil have you been? What is the meaning of all this finery, Oho? I understand you. You are just arrived from the country. What, the roads are good, eh? Well, Random, you are a bold fellow and a lucky fellow. But take care, the pitcher goes often to the well, but is broke at last." So saying, he pointed to his collar, by which gesture and the broken hints he had ejaculated, I found he suspected me of having robbed on the highway, and I laughed very heartily at his supposition. Without explaining myself any further, I told him he was mistaken in his conjecture, that I had been for some time past with the relation of whom he had frequently heard me speak, and that, as I should set out next day upon my travels, I had come to take my leave of my friends, and to receive of him the money he had borrowed from me, which, now that I was going abroad, I should certainly have occasion for. He was a little disconcerted at this demand, but, recollecting himself in a moment, swore in an affected passion that I had used him extremely ill, and he would never forgive me for having, by this short warning, put it out of his power to free himself of an obligation he could no longer bear. I could not help smiling at this pretended delicacy, which I commended highly, telling him he needed not to be uneasy on that score, for I would give him a direction to a merchant in the city, with whom I would leave a discharge on the sum, to be delivered upon payment. He professed much joy at this expedient, and with great eagerness asked the person's name and place of abode, which he forthwith wrote in his pocket-book, assuring me that he should not be long in my debt. This affair, which I knew he should never after think of, being settled to his satisfaction, I sent cards to all my friends, desiring the favor of their company at a tavern in the evening, when they honored my invitation, and I had the pleasure of treating them in a very elegant manner, at which they expressed equal admiration as applause. Having enjoyed ourselves till midnight, I took my leave of them, and was well nigh stifled with caresses. Next day, I set out with Strap in a post-chaise for Gravesend, where we went on board, and the wind serving, weighed anchor in less than 12 hours. Without meeting with any accident, we reached the Downs, where we were obliged to come to an anchor, and wait for an easterly wind to carry us out of the channel. Chapter 65. I set out for Sussex. Consult Mrs. Sagely, achieve an interview with Narcissa, return to the ship. We get clear of the channel, I learn our destination, we are chased by a large ship. The company are dismayed and encouraged by the captain's speech. Our pursuer happens to be an English man of war. We arrive at the coast of Guinea, purchase 400 Negroes, sail for Paraguay, get safe into the River of Plate, and sell our cargo to great advantage. It was now I put in execution the scheme I had projected at London, and asking leave of the captain for Strap and me to stay on shore till the wind should become favorable, my request was granted, because he had orders to remain in the Downs until he should receive some dispatches from London, which he did not expect in less than a week. Having imparted my resolution to my trusty valet, who, though he endeavored to dissuade me from such a rash undertaking, would not quit me in the enterprise, I hired horses and set out immediately for that part of Sussex where my charmer was confined, which was not above 30 miles distant from Deal, where we mounted. As I was perfectly well acquainted with the extent of the squire's estate and influence, I halted within 5 miles of his house, where we remained till the twilight, at which time we set forward, and, by the favor of a dark night, reached a copse about half a mile from the village where Mrs. Sagely lived. Here we left our horses tied to a tree, and went directly to the house of my old benefactress, Strap trembling all the way and venting ejaculatory petitions to heaven for our safety. Her habitation being quite solitary, we arrived at the door without being observed, when I ordered my companion to enter by himself, and, in case there should be company with her, deliver a letter which I had writ for that purpose, and say that a friend of hers in London, understanding that he intended to travel this road, had committed it to his care. He rapped at the door, to which the good old matron coming, told him that, being a lone woman, he must excuse her, if she did not open it, until he had declared his name and business. He answered that his name was unknown to her, and that his business was to deliver a letter, which, to free her from all apprehension, he would convey to her through the space between the door and threshold. This he instantly performed, and she no sooner read the contents, which specified my being present, than she cried, "If the person who wrote this letter be at hand, let him speak, that I may be assured by his voice whether or not I may safely admit him." I forthwith applied my mouth to the keyhole, and pronounced, "Dear mother, you need not be afraid, it is I, so much indebted to your goodness, who now crave admittance." She knew my voice, and opening the door immediately, received me with a truly maternal affection, manifesting, by the tears she let fall, her concern lest I should be discovered, for she had been informed of everything that had happened between Narcissa and me from the dear captive's own mouth. When I explained the motive of my journey, which was no other than a desire of seeing the object of my love before I should quit the kingdom, that I might in person convince her of the necessity I was under to leave her, reconcile her to that event, by describing the advantages that in all probability would attend it, repeat my vows of eternal constancy, and enjoy the melancholy pleasure of a tender embrace at parting. I say, when I had thus signified my intention, Mrs. Sagely told me that Narcissa, upon her return from Bath, had been so strictly watched that nobody but 1 or 2 of the servants devoted to her brother was admitted to her presence, that afterwards she had been a little enlarged, and was permitted to see company, during which indulgence she had been several times at the cottage. But of late she had been betrayed by one of the servants, who discovered to the squire that he had once carried a letter from her to the post-house directed to me, upon which information she was now more confined than ever, and that I could have no chance of seeing her, unless I would run the risk of getting into the garden, where she and her maid were every day allowed to take the air, and lie hid until I should have an opportunity of speaking to them. An adventure attended with such danger that no man in his right wits would attempt it. This enterprise, hazardous as it was, I resolved to perform, in spite of all the arguments of Mrs. Sagely, who reasoned, chid, and entreated by turns, and the tears and prayers of Strap, who conjured me on his knees to have more regard to myself as well as to him than to attempt my own destruction in such a precipitate manner. I was deaf to but the suggestions of my love, and ordering him to return immediately with the horses to the inn from whence we set out and wait for my coming in that place, he at first peremptorily refused to leave me, until I persuaded him that if our horses should remain where they were till daylight, they would certainly be discovered and the whole country alarmed. On this consideration, he took his leave in a sorrowful plight, kissed my hand, and, weeping, cried, "God knows if ever I shall see you again." My kind landlady, finding me obstinate, gave me her best advice how to behave in the execution of my project, and after having persuaded me to take a little refreshment, accommodated me with a bed and left me to my repose. Early in the morning I arose, and armed with a couple of loaded pistols and a hanger, went to the back part of the squire's garden, climbed over the wall, and, according to Mrs. Sagely's direction, concealed myself in a thicket, hard by an alcove that terminated a walk at a good distance from the house, which I was told my mistress mostly frequented. Here I absconded from 5 o'clock in the morning to 6 in the evening, without seeing a human creature. At last I perceived 2 women approaching, whom, by my throbbing heart, I soon recognized to be the adorable Narcissa and Miss Williams. I felt the strongest agitation of soul at the sight, and guessing that they would repose themselves in the alcove, stepped into it unperceived and hid upon the stone table a picture of myself in miniature, for which I had sat in London, purposing to leave it with Narcissa before I should go abroad. I exposed it in this manner as an introduction to my own appearance, which, without some previous intimation, I was afraid might have an unlucky effect upon the delicate nerves of my fair enslaver, and then withdrew into the thicket, where I could hear their discourse, and suit myself to the circumstance of the occasion. As they advanced, I observed an air of melancholy in the countenance of Narcissa, blended with such unspeakable sweetness, that I could scarce refrain from flying into her arms and kissing away the pearly drop that stood collected in each bewitching eye. According to my expectation, she entered the alcove, and perceiving something on the table, took it up. No sooner did she cast her eye upon the features, than, startled at the resemblance, she cried, "Good God!" and the roses instantly vanished from her cheeks. Her confidant, alarmed at this exclamation, looked at the picture, and struck with the likeness, exclaimed, "Jesus, the very features of Mr. Random." Narcissa, having recollected herself a little, said, "Whatever angel brought it hither as a comfort to me in my affliction, I am thankful for the benefit, and will preserve it as the dearest object of my care." So saying, she kissed it with surprising ardor, shed a flood of tears, and then deposited the lifeless image in her lovely bosom. Transported at these symptoms of her unaltered affection, I was about to throw myself at her feet, when Miss Williams, whose reflection was less engaged than that of her mistress, observed that the picture could not transport itself hither, and that she could not help thinking I was not far off. The gentle Narcissa, starting at this conjecture, answered, "Heaven forbid." For although nothing in the universe could yield me satisfaction equal to that of his presence for one poor moment, in a proper place, I would rather forfeit his company, almost forever, than see him here, where his life would be exposed to so much danger. I could no longer restrain the impulse of my passion, but breaking from my concealment, stood before her, when she uttered a fearful shriek, and fainted in the arms of her companion. I flew towards the treasure of my soul, clasped her in my embrace, and with the warmth of my kisses, brought her again to life. Oh, that I were endowed with the expression of a Raphael, the graces of a Guido, the magic touches of a Titian, that I might represent the fond concern, the chastened rapture and ingenuous blush that mingled on her beauteous face when she opened her eyes upon me and pronounced, "O heavens, is it you?" I am afraid I have already encroached upon the reader's patience with the particulars of this amour, of which, I own, I cannot help being impertinently circumstantial. I shall therefore omit the less material passages of this interview, during which I convinced her reason, though I could not appease the sad presages of her love, with regard to the long voyage and dangers I must undergo. When we had spent an hour, which was all she could spare from the barbarity of her brother's vigilance, in lamenting over our hard fate, and in repeating our reciprocal vows, Miss Williams reminded us of the necessity there was for our immediate parting. And sure, lovers never parted with such sorrow and reluctance as we. But because my words are incapable of doing justice to this affecting circumstance, I am obliged to draw a veil over it, and observe that I returned in the dark to the house of Mrs. Sagely, who was overjoyed to hear of my success, and opposed the tumults of my grief with such strength of reason that my mind regained, in some measure, its tranquillity. And that very night, after having forced upon the good gentlewoman a purse of 20 guineas, as a token of my gratitude and esteem, I took my leave of her, and set out on foot for the inn, where my arrival freed honest Strap from the horrors of unutterable dread. We took horse immediately, and alighted early next morning at Deal, where I found my uncle in great concern on account of my absence, because he had received his dispatches, and must have weighed with the first fair wind, whether I had been on board or not. Next day, a brisk easterly gale springing up, we set sail, and in 48 hours got clear of the channel. When we were about 200 leagues to westward of the Land's End, the captain, taking me apart into the cabin, told me that, now he was permitted by his instructions, he would disclose the intent and destination of our voyage. "The ship," said he, "which has been fitted out at a great expense, is bound for the coast of Guinea, where we shall exchange part of our cargo for slaves and gold dust, from whence we will transport our negroes to Buenos Aires in New Spain, where by virtue of passports, obtained from our own court and that of Madrid, we will dispose of them and the goods that remain on board for silver, by means of our supercargo, who is perfectly well acquainted with the coast, the lingo, and inhabitants." Being thus let into the secret of our expedition, I borrowed of the supercargo a Spanish grammar, dictionary, and some other books of the same language, which I studied with such application that, before we arrived in New Spain, I could maintain a conversation with him in that tongue. Being arrived in the warm latitudes, I ordered, with the captain's consent, the whole ship's company to be blooded and purged, myself undergoing the same evacuation, in order to prevent those dangerous fevers to which northern constitutions are subject in hot climates. And I have reason to believe that this precaution was not unserviceable, for we lost but one sailor during our whole passage to the coast. One day, when we had been about 5 weeks at sea, we descried to windward a large ship bearing down upon us with all the sail she could carry. Upon which my uncle ordered the studding sails to be hoisted and the ship to be cleared for engaging. But finding that, to use the seaman's phrase, we were very much wronged by the ship which had us in chase, and by this time had hoisted French colors, he commanded the studding sails to be taken in, the courses to be clowed up, the main topsail to be backed, the tompions to be taken out of the guns, and every man to repair to his quarters. While every body was busied in the performance of these orders, Strap came upon the quarter-deck, trembling and looking aghast, and with a voice half suppressed by fear, asked if I thought we were a match for the vessel in pursuit of us. Observing his consternation, I said, "What are you afraid, Strap?" "Afraid," he replied, "no, what should I be afraid of? I thank God I have a clear conscience, but I believe it will be a bloody battle, and I wish you may not have occasion for another hand to assist you in the cockpit." I immediately perceived his drift, and making the captain acquainted with his situation, desired he might be stationed below with me and my mates. My uncle, incensed at his pusillanimity, bade me send him down instantly, that his fear might not infect the ship's company, whereupon I told the poor steward that I had begged him for my assistant, and desired him to go down and help my mates to get ready the instruments and dressings. Notwithstanding the satisfaction he must have felt at those tidings, he affected a shyness of quitting the upper deck, and said he hoped I did not imagine he was afraid to do his duty above board, for he believed himself as well prepared for death as any man in the ship, no disparagement to me or the captain. I was disgusted at this affectation, and in order to punish his hypocrisy, assured him he might take his choice, either of going down to the cockpit with me or staying upon deck during the engagement. Alarmed at this indifference, he replied, "Well, to oblige you, I'll go down, but remember it is more for your sake than my own." So saying, he disappeared in a twinkling, without waiting for an answer. By this time, we could observe 2 tier of guns in the ship which pursued us, and which was now but 2 short miles astern. This discovery had an evident effect upon the sailors, who did not scruple to say that we should be torn to pieces and blown out of the water, and that, if in case any of them should lose their precious limbs, they must go a-begging for life, for there was no provision made by the merchants for those poor souls who are maimed in their service. The captain, understanding this, ordered the crew abaft and spoke to them thus: "My lads, I am told you hang in a sea. I have gone to sea 30 years, a man and a boy, and never saw English sailors afraid before. Mayhap you may think I want to expose you for the lucre of gain. Whosoever thinks so thinks a d. Ned lie, for my whole cargo is insured so that in case I should be taken, my loss would not be great. The enemy is stronger than we, to be sure. What then? Have we not a chance for carrying away one of her masts, and so get clear of her? If we find her too hard for us, tease but striking at last. If any man is hurt in the engagement, I promise on the word of an honest seaman to make him a recompense according to his loss. So now, you that are lazy, lubberly, cowardly dogs, get away and skulk in the hold and bedroom, and you that are jolly boys, stand by me, and let us give one broadside for the honor of old England. This eloquent harangue was so well adapted to the disposition of his hearers that one and all of them, pulling off their hats, waved them over their heads, and saluted him with 3 cheers. Upon which he sent his boy for 2 large case bottles of brandy. Having treated every man with a dram, they repaired to their quarters and waited impatiently for the word of command. I must do my uncle the justice to say that in the whole of his disposition he behaved with the utmost intrepidity, conduct, and deliberation. The enemy being very near, he ordered me to my station, and was just going to give the word for hoisting the colors and firing when the supposed Frenchman hauled down his white pennant, jack and ensign, hoisted English ones, and fired a gun ahead of us. This was a joyful event to Captain Bowling, who immediately showed his colors and fired a gun to leeward, upon which the other ship ran alongside of us, hailed him, and, giving him to know that she was an English man-o'-war of 40 guns, ordered him to hoist out his boat and come on board. This command he obeyed with the more alacrity, because, upon inquiry, he found that she was commanded by an old messmate of his, who was overjoyed to see him, detained him to dinner, and sent his barge for the supercargo and me, who were very much caressed on his account. As this commander was destined to cruise upon the French in the latitude of Martinico, his stem and quarters were adorned with white fleur-de-lis, and the whole shell of the ship so much disguised for a decoy to the enemy that it was no wonder my uncle did not know her, although he had sailed on board of her many years. We kept company with her 4 days, during which time the captains were never asunder, and then parted, our course lying different from hers. In less than fortnight after our separation, we made the land of Guinea, near the mouth of the river Gambia, and trading along the coast as far to the southward of the line as Angola and Benguela, in less than 6 months disposed of the greatest part of our cargo, and purchased 400 Negroes, my adventure having been laid out in gold dust. Our complement being made up, we took our departure from Cape Negro, and arrived in the Rio de la Plata in 6 weeks, having met with nothing remarkable in our voyage, except an epidemic fever, not unlike the jail distemper, which broke out among our slaves and carried off a good many of the ship's company, among whom I lost one of my mates, and poor Strap had well nigh given up the ghost. Having produced our passport to the Spanish governor, we were received with great courtesy, sold our slaves in a very few days, and could have put off 5 times the number at our own price, though we were obliged to smuggle the rest of our merchandise, consisting of European bale goods, which however we made shift to dispose of at a great advantage. Chapter 66. I am invited to the villa of a Spanish don, where we went with an English gentleman and make a very interesting discovery. We leave Buenos Aires and arrive at Jamaica. Our ship being freed from the disagreeable lading of Negroes, to whom indeed I had been a miserable slave since our leaving the coast of Guinea, I began to enjoy myself and breathe with pleasure the pure air of Paraguay, this part of which is reckoned the Montpelier of South America, and has obtained, on account of its climate, the name of Buenos Aires. It was in this delicious place that I gave myself entirely up to the thoughts of my dear Narcissa, whose image still kept possession of my breast, and whose charms, enhanced by absence, appeared to my imagination, if possible, more engaging than ever. I calculated the profits of my voyage, which even exceeded my expectation, resolved to purchase sinecure upon my arrival in England, and if I should find the squire as averse to me as ever, marry his sister by stealth, and in case our family should increase, rely on the generosity of my uncle, who was by this time worth a considerable sum. While I amused myself with these agreeable projects, and the transporting thoughts of enjoying Narcissa, we were very much caressed by the Spanish gentlemen, who frequently formed parties of pleasure for our entertainment, in which we made excursions a good way into the country. Among those who signalized themselves by their civility to us was one Don Antonio de Ribra, a very polite young gentleman, with whom I had contracted an intimate friendship, who invited us one day to his country house, and, as a further inducement to our compliance, promised to procure for us the company of an English signor, who had been settled in those parts many years and acquired the love and esteem of the whole province by his affability, good sense, and honorable behavior. We accepted his invitation and set out for his villa, where we had not been longer than an hour, when the person arrived in whose favor I had been so much prepossessed. He was a tall man, remarkably well-shaped, of a fine mien and appearance, commanding respect, and seemed to be turned of 40. The features of his face were saddened with a reserve and gravity, which in other countries would have been thought the effect of melancholy, but here appeared to have been contracted by his commerce with the Spaniards, who are remarkable for that severity of countenance. Understanding from Don Antonio that we were his countrymen, he saluted us all round very complacently, and fixing his eyes attentively on me, uttered a deep sigh. I had been struck with a profound veneration for him at his first coming into the room, and no sooner observed this expression of his sorrow, directed, as it were, in a particular manner to me, that my heart took part in his grief. I sympathized involuntarily and sighed in my turn. Having asked leave of our entertainer, he accosted us in English, professed his satisfaction at seeing so many of his countrymen in such a remote place, and asked the captain, who went by the name of Signor Toma, from what part of Britain he had sailed and whither he was bound. My uncle told him that we had sailed from the river Thames and were bound for the same place by the way of Jamaica, where we intended to take in a lading of sugar. Having satisfied himself in these and other particulars about the state of the war, he gave us to understand that he had a longing desire to revisit his native country, in consequence of which he had already transmitted to Europe the greatest part of his fortune in neutral bottoms, and would willingly embark the rest of it with himself in our ship, provided the captain had no objection to such a passenger. My uncle very prudently replied that for his part he should be glad of his company, if he could procure the consent of the governor, without which he durst not take him on board, whatever inclination he had to oblige him. The gentleman approved of his discretion, and telling him that there would be no difficulty in obtaining the connivance of the governor, who was his good friend, shifted the conversation to another subject. I was overjoyed to hear his intention, and already interested myself so much in his favor that, had he been disappointed, I should have been very unhappy. In the course of our entertainment, he eyed me with uncommon attachment. I felt a surprising attraction towards him. When he spoke, I listened with attention and reverence. The dignity of his deportment filled me with affection and awe, and, in short, the emotions of my soul, in presence of this stranger, were strong and unaccountable. Having spent the best part of the day with us, he took his leave, telling Captain Toma that he should hear from him in a short time. He was no sooner gone than I asked 1,000 questions about him of Don Antonio, who could give me no other satisfaction than that his name was Don Rodrigo, that he had lived 15 or 16 years in these parts, was reputed rich, and supposed to have been unfortunate in his younger years, because he was observed to nourish a pensive melancholy, even from the time of his first settlement among them. But that nobody had ventured to inquire into the cause of his sorrow, in consideration of his peace, which might suffer in the recapitulation of his misfortunes. I was seized with an irresistible desire of knowing the particulars of his fate, and enjoyed not an hour of repose during the whole night, by reason of the eager conceptions that inspired me with regard to his story, which I resolved, if possible, to learn. Next morning, while we were at breakfast, 3 mules, richly caparisoned, arrived with a message from Don Rodrigo, desiring our company, and that of Don Antonio, at his house, which was situated about 10 miles further up in the country. I was pleased with this invitation, in consequence of which we mounted the mules which he had provided for us, and alighted at his house before noon. Here we were splendidly entertained by the generous stranger, who still seemed to show a particular regard for me, and after dinner made me a present of a ring, set with a beautiful amethyst, the production of that country, saying, at the same time, that he was once blessed with a son, who, had he lived, would have been nearly of my age. This observation, delivered with a profound sigh, made my heart throb with violence. A crowd of confused ideas rushed upon my imagination, which, while I endeavored to unravel, my uncle perceived my absence of thought, and tapping me on the shoulder, said, "Oons, are you asleep, Rory?" Before I had time to reply, Don Rodrigo, with uncommon eagerness of voice and look, pronounced, "Pray, Captain, what is the young gentleman's name?" "His name," said my uncle, "is Roderick Random." "Gracious powers!" cried the stranger, starting up, "and his mother, S." "His mother," answered the captain, amazed, "was called Charlotte Bowling." "Oh, bounteous heaven!" exclaimed Don Rodrigo, springing across the table and clasping me in his arms. My son, have I found thee again? Do I hold thee in my embrace after having lost and despaired of seeing thee so long?" So saying, he fell upon my neck and wept aloud with joy, while the power of nature operating strongly in my breast. I was lost in rapture, and while he pressed me to his heart, let fall a shower of tears in his bosom. His utterance was choked up a good while by the agitation of his soul. At length he broke out into mysterious providence. "Oh, my dear Charlotte, there yet remains a pledge of our love, and such a pledge, so found. O infinite goodness, let me adore thy always decrees." Having thus expressed himself, he kneeled upon the floor, lifted up his eyes and hands to heaven, and remained some minutes in silent ecstasy of devotion. I put myself in the same posture, adored the all-good dispenser in a prayer of mental thanksgiving, and when his ejaculation was ended, did homage to my father and craved his paternal blessing. He hugged me again with unutterable fondness, and having implored the protection of heaven upon my head, raised me from the ground, and presented me as his son to the company, who wept in concert over this affecting scene. Among the rest, my uncle did not fail to discover the goodness and joy of his heart. Albeit unused to the melting mood, he blubbered with great tenderness, and wringing my father's hand, cried, "Brother Random, I'm rejoiced to see you. God be praised for this happy meeting." Don Rodrigo, understanding that he was his brother-in-law, embraced him affectionately, saying, "Are you my Charlotte's brother, alas? Unhappy Charlotte, but why should I repine? We shall meet again, never more to part. Brother, you are truly welcome. Dear son, I am transported with unspeakable joy. This day is a jubilee. My friends and servants shall share my satisfaction." While he dispatched messengers to the gentlemen in the neighborhood to announce this event and gave orders for a grand entertainment, I was so much affected with the tumults of passion, which assailed me on this great, sudden, and unexpected occasion, that I fell sick, fevered, and in less than 3 hours became quite delirious, so that the preparations were countermanded, and the joy of the family converted into grief and despair. Physicians were instantly called. I was plentifully blooded in the foot. My lower extremities were bathed in a decoction of salutiferous herbs. In 10 hours after I was taken ill, I enjoyed a critical sweat, and next day felt the remains of the distemper, but an agreeable lassitude, which did not hinder me from getting up. During the progress of this fever, which, from the term or its duration, is called ephemera, my father never once quitted my bedside, but administered the prescriptions of the physicians with the most pious care, while Captain Bowling manifested his concern by the like attendance. I no sooner found myself delivered from this disease than I bethought myself of my honest friend Strap, and resolving to make him happy forthwith in the knowledge of my good fortune, told my father in general that I had been infinitely obliged to this faithful adherent, and begged he would indulge me so far as to send for him, without letting him know my happiness, until he could receive an account of it from my own mouth. My request was instantly complied with, and a messenger with a spare mule dispatched to the ship, carrying orders from the captain to the mate, to send the steward by the bearer. My health being, in the meantime, re-established, and my mind composed, I began to relish this important turn of my fortune, in reflecting upon the advantages with which it must be attended. And, as the idea of my lovely Narcissa always joined itself to every scene of happiness I could imagine, I entertained myself now with the prospect of possessing her in that distinguished sphere to which she was entitled by her birth and qualifications. Having often mentioned her name while I was deprived of my senses, my father guessed that there was an intimate connection between us, and discovering the picture which hung in my bosom by ribbon, did not doubt that it was the resemblance of my amiable mistress. In this belief he was confirmed by my uncle, who told him that it was the picture of a young woman to whom I was under promise of marriage. Alarmed at this piece of information, Don Rodrigo took the first opportunity of questioning me about the particulars of this affair, which when I had candidly recounted, he approved of my passion, and promised to contribute all in his power towards its success. Though I never doubted his generosity, I was transported on this occasion, and throwing myself at his feet, told him he had now completed my happiness, for, without the possession of Narcissa, I should be miserable among all the pleasures of life. He raised me with a smile of paternal fondness, said he knew what it was to be in love, and observed that, if he had been as tenderly beloved by his father as I was by mine, he should not now perhaps have cause. Here he was interrupted by a sigh. The tear rushed into his eye, suppressed the dictates of his grief, and the time being opportune, desired me to relate the passages of my life, which my uncle had told him were manifold and surprising. I recounted the most material circumstances of my fortune, to which he listened with wonder and attention, manifesting from time to time the different emotions which my different situations may be supposed to have raised in a parent's breast. And when my detail was ended, blessed God for the adversity I had undergone, which, he said, enlarged the understanding, improved the heart, steeled the constitution, and qualified a young man for all the duties and enjoyments of life much better than any education which affluence could bestow. When I had thus satisfied his curiosity, I discovered an inclination to hear the particulars of his story, which he gratified by beginning with his marriage, and proceeded to the day of his disappearing, as I have related in the first part of my memoirs. Careless of life, continued he, and unable to live in a place where every object recalled the memory of my dear Charlotte, whom I had lost through the barbarity of an unnatural parent, I took my leave of you, my child, then an infant, with a heart full of unutterable woe, but little suspecting that my father's unkindness would have descended to my innocent orphan. And setting out alone at midnight for the nearest seaport, early next morning got on board a ship bound, as I had heard, for France. And bargaining with the master for my passage, bade a long adieu to my native country, and put to sea with the first fair wind. The place of our destination was Granville, but we had the misfortune to run upon a ridge of rocks near the island of Alderney, called the Casquets, where the sea running high, the ship went to pieces, the boat sunk alongside, and every soul on board perished, except myself, who, by the assistance of a grating, got ashore on the coast of Normandy. I went directly to Keene, where I was so lucky as to meet with a count, whom I had formerly known in my travels. With this gentleman I set out for Paris, where I was recommended by him and other friends as tutor to a young nobleman, whom I accompanied to the court of Spain. There we remained a whole year, at the end of which, my pupil being recalled by his father, I quitted my office, and stayed behind by the advice of a certain Spanish grandee, who took me into his protection, and introduced me to another nobleman, who was afterwards created Viceroy of Peru. He insisted on my attending him to his government of the Indies, where, however, by reason of my religion, it was not in his power to make my fortune any other way than by encouraging me to trade, which I had not long prosecuted when my patron died, and I found myself in the midst of strangers, without one friend to support or protect me. Urged by this consideration, I sold my effects and removed to this country, the governor of which, having been appointed by the viceroy, was my intimate acquaintance. Here has heaven prospered my endeavors, during a residence of 16 years, in which my tranquillity was never invaded but by the remembrance of your mother, whose death I have in secret mourned without ceasing, and the reflection of you, whose fate I could never learn notwithstanding all my inquiries by means of my friends in France, who, after the most strict examination, could give me no other account than that you went abroad 6 years ago and was never after heard of. I could not rest satisfied with this imperfect information, and though my hope of finding you was but languid, resolved to go in quest of you in person. For which purpose, I have remitted to Holland the value of £20,000, and am in possession of 15,000 more, with which I intended to embark myself on board of Captain Bowling, before I discovered this amazing stroke of Providence, which, you may be sure, has not altered my intention. My father, having entertained us with this agreeable sketch of his life, withdrew in order to relieve Don Antonio, who, in his absence, had done the honors of his house, and I was just dressed for my appearance among the guests, when Strap arrived from the ship. He no sooner entered the grand apartment in which I was, and saw the magnificence of my apparel, than his speech was lost in amazement, and he gaped in silence at the objects that surrounded him. I took him by the hand, observed that I had sent for him to be a witness and sharer of my happiness, and told him I had found a father. At these words he started, and after having continued some minutes with his mouth and eyes wide open, cried, "Ah, odd, I know what. Go thy ways, poor Narcissa, and go thy ways somebody else. Well, Lord, what a thing is love! God help us! Are all our mad pranks and protestations come to this? And have you fixed your habitation in this distant land? God prosper you. I find we must part at last, for I would not leave my poor carcase so far from my native home for all the wealth of the universe." With these ejaculations, he began to sob and make wry faces, upon which I assured him of his mistake, both in regard to my staying in Paraguay, and informed him as briefly as I could of the great event that had happened. Never was rapture more ludicrously expressed than in the behavior of this worthy creature, who cried, laughed, whistled, sung, and danced, all in a breath. His transport was scarce over when my father entered, who no sooner understood that this was Strap than he took him by the hand, saying, "Is this the honest man who befriended you so much in your distress? You are welcome to my house, and I will soon put it in the power of my son to reward you for your good offices in his behalf. In the meantime, go with us and partake of the repast that is provided." Strap, wild as he was with joy, would by no means accept of the proffered honor, crying, "God forbid. I know my distance. Your worship shall excuse me." And Don Rodrigo, finding his modesty invincible, recommended him to his majordomo to be treated with the utmost respect, while he carried me in a large saloon, where I was presented to a numerous company, who loaded me with compliments and caresses, and congratulated my father in terms not proper for me to repeat. Without specifying the particulars of our entertainment, let it suffice to say, it was at the same time elegant and sumptuous, and the rejoicings lasted 2 days. After which, Don Rodrigo settled his affairs, converted his effects into silver and gold, visited and took leave of all his friends, who were grieved at his departure, and honored me with considerable presents. And coming on board of my uncle's ship, with the first fair wind we sailed from the Rio de la Plata, and in 2 months came safe to an anchor in the harbor of Kingston, in the island of Jamaica. Chapter 67. I visit my old friend Thompson. We set sail for Europe, meet with an odd adventure, arrive in England. I ride across the country from Portsmouth to Sussex, converse with Mrs. Sagely, who informs me of Narcissa's being in London. In consequence of this intelligence, I proceed to Canterbury, meet with my old friend Morgan, arrive in London, visit Narcissa, introduce my father to her. He is charmed with her good sense and beauty. We come to a determination of demanding her brother's consent to our marriage. I inquired, as soon as I got ashore, about my generous companion, Mr. Thompson, and hearing that he lived in a flourishing condition upon the estate left him by his wife's father, who had been dead some years, I took horse immediately, with the consent of Don Rodrigo, who had heard me mention him with great regard, and in a few hours reached the place of his habitation. I should much wrong the delicacy of Mr. Thompson's sentiments to say barely he was glad to see me. He felt all that the most sensible and disinterested friendship could feel on this occasion, introduced me to his wife, a very amiable young lady, who had already blessed him with 2 fine children, and being as yet ignorant of my circumstances, frankly offered me the assistance of his purse and interest. I thanked him for his generous intention, and made him acquainted with my situation, on which he congratulated me with great joy, and, after I had stayed with him a whole day and night, accompanied me back to Kingston to wait upon my father, whom he invited to his house. Don Rodrigo complied with his request, and, having been handsomely entertained during the space of a week, returned extremely well satisfied with the behavior of my friend and his lady, to whom, at parting, he presented a very valuable diamond ring, as a token of his esteem. During the course of my conversation with Mr. Thompson, he gave me to understand that his old commander, Captain Oakham, was dead some months, and that, immediately after his death, a discovery had been made of some valuable effects that he had feloniously secreted out of a prize by the assistance of Dr. Mackshane, who was now actually in prison on that account, and, being destitute of friends, subsisted solely on the charity of my friend, whose bounty he had implored in the most abject manner. After having been the barbarous occasion of driving him to that terrible extremity on board of the Thunder, which we have formerly related. Whatsoever this wretch had been guilty of, I applauded Mr. Thompson's generosity towards him in his distress, which wrought so much upon me also, that I sent him 10 pistoles in such a private manner that he could never know his benefactor. While my father and I were caressed among the gentlemen on shore, Captain Bowling had written to his owners, by the packet, which sailed a few days after our arrival, signifying his prosperous voyage hitherto, and desiring them to insure his ship and cargo homeward bound. After which precaution he applied himself so heartily to the task of loading his ship that, with the assistance of Mr. Thompson, she was full in less than 6 weeks. This kind gentleman likewise procured for Don Rodrigo bills upon London for the greatest part of his gold and silver, by which means it was secured against the risk of the seas and the enemy, and, before we sailed, supplied us with such large quantities of all kinds of stock, that not only we, but the ship's company, fared sumptuously during the voyage. Everything being ready, we took our leave of our kind entertainers, and going on board at Port Royal, set sail for England on the 1st day of June. We beat up to windward, with fine, easy weather, and one night, believing ourselves near Cape Tiburon, lay to, with an intention to wood and water next morning in the bay. While we remained in this situation, a sailor, having drunk more new rum than he could carry, staggered overboard, and notwithstanding all the means that could be used to preserve him, went to the bottom and disappeared. About 2 hours after this melancholy accident happened, as I enjoyed the cool air on the quarterdeck, I heard a voice rising, as it were, out of the sea and calling, "Ho, the ship ahoy!" Upon which one of the men upon the forecastle cried, "I'll be d and if that ain't Jack Marlinspike who went overboard." Not a little surprised at this event, I jumped into the boat that lay alongside, with the second mate and 4 men, and rowing towards the place from whence the voice, which repeated the hail, seemed to proceed, we perceived something floating upon the water. When we had rowed a little further, we discerned it to be a man riding upon a hen-coop, who, seeing us approach, pronounced with a hoarse voice, "D and your bloods, why did you not answer when I hailed?" Our mate, who was a veritable seaman, hearing his salute, said, "By G, my lads, this is none of our man. This is the devil, pull away for the ship." The fellows obeyed his command without question, and were already some fathoms on our return, when I insisted on their taking up the poor creature, and prevailed upon them to go back to the wreck, which, when we came near the second time, and signified our intention, we received an answer of "Avast, avast," "What ship, brother?" Being satisfied in this particular, he cried, "And the ship, I was in hopes it had been my own. Where are you bound?" We satisfied his curiosity in this particular too, upon which he suffered himself to be taken on board, and, after having been comforted with a dram, told us he belonged to the Vesuvio man-o'-war upon a cruise off the island of Hispaniola, that he had fallen overboard 24 hours ago, and the ship being under sail, they did not choose to bring to, but tossed a hencoop overboard for his convenience, upon which he was in good hopes of reaching the Cape next morning. Howsomever, he was as well content to be aboard of us because he did not doubt that we should meet his ship, and if he had gone ashore in the bay, he might have been taken prisoner by the French. My uncle and father were very much diverted with the account of this fellow's unconcerned behavior, and in 2 days, meeting with the Vesuvio, as he expected, sent him on board of her, according to his desire. Having beat up successfully the windward passage, we stretched to the northward, and falling in with a westerly wind, in 8 weeks arrived in the soundings, and in 2 days after made for the Lizard. It is impossible to express the joy I felt at the sight of English ground. Don Rodrigo was not unmoved, and Strap shed tears of gladness. The sailors profited by our satisfaction, the shoe that was nailed to the mast being quite filled with our liberality. My uncle resolved to run up into the Downs at once, but the wind shifting when we were abreast of the Isle of Wight, he was obliged to turn into St. Helens, and come to Spit Head, to the great mortification of the crew, 30 of whom were immediately pressed on board a man-o'-war. My father and I went ashore immediately at Portsmouth, leaving Strap with the captain to go round with the ship and take care of our effects, and I discovered so much impatience to see my charming Narcissa that my father permitted me to ride across the country to her brother's house, while he should hire a post-chaise for London, where he would wait for me at a place to which I directed him. Fired with all the eagerness of passion, I took post that very night, and in the morning reached an inn about 3 miles from the squire's habitation. Here I remained till next morning, allaying the torture of my impatience with the rapturous hope of seeing that divine creature after an absence of 18 months, which, far from impairing, had raised my love to the most exalted pitch. Neither were my reflections free from apprehensions. That something intervened in spite of all my hope, and represented her as having yielded to the importunity of her brother and blessed the arms of a happy rival. My thoughts were even maddened with the fear of her death, and, when I arrived in the dark at the house of Mrs. Sagely, I had not for some time courage to desire admittance, lest my soul should be shocked with dismal tidings. At length, however, I knocked, and no sooner certified the good gentlewoman of my voice than she opened the door, and received me with the most affectionate embrace that brought tears into her aged eyes. "For heaven's sake, dear mother," cried I, "tell me how is Narcissa? Is she the same that I left her?" She blessed my ears with saying, "She is as beautiful, in as good health, and as much yours as ever." Transported at this assurance, I begged to know if I could not see her that very night, when this sage matron gave me to understand that my mistress was in London, and that things were strangely altered in the squire's house since my departure. That he had been married a whole year to Melinda, who at first found means to wean his attention so much from Narcissa, that he became quite careless of that lovely sister, comforting himself with the clause in his father's will, by which she should forfeit her fortune by marrying without his consent. That my mistress, being but indifferently treated by her sister-in-law, had made use of her freedom some months ago, and gone to town, where she was lodged with Miss Williams, in expectation of my arrival, and had been pestered with the addresses of Lord Quiverwit, who, finding her heart engaged, had fallen upon a great many shifts to persuade her that I was dead. But, finding all his artifices unsuccessful, and despairing of gaining her affection, he had consoled himself for her indifference by marrying another lady some weeks ago, who had already left him on account of some family uneasiness. Besides this interesting information, she told me there was not a great deal of harmony between Melinda and the squire, who was so much disgusted at the number of gallants who continued to hover about her even after her marriage, that he had hurried her down into the country, much against her own inclination, where their mutual animosities had risen to such a height, that they preserved no decency before company or servants, but abused one another in the grossest terms. This good old gentlewoman, to give me a convincing proof of my dear Narcissa's unalterable love, gratified me with a sight of the last letter she had favored her with, in which I was mentioned with so much honor, tenderness, and concern that my soul was fired with impatience, and I determined to ride all night, that I might have it the sooner in my power to make her happy. Mrs. Sagely, perceiving my eagerness, and her maternal affection being equally divided between Narcissa and me, begged leave to remind me of the sentiments with which I went abroad, that would not permit me for any selfish gratification to prejudice the fortune of that amiable young lady, who must entirely depend upon me after having bestowed herself in marriage. I thanked her for her kind concern, and as briefly as possible described my flourishing situation, which afforded this humane person infinite wonder and satisfaction. I told her that now I had an opportunity to manifest my gratitude for the many obligations I owed, I would endeavor to make her old age comfortable and easy. As a step to which I proposed, she should come and live with Narcissa and me. This venerable gentlewoman was so much affected with my words that the tears ran down her ancient cheeks. She thanked heaven that I had not belied the presages she had made, on her first acquaintance with me, acknowledging my generosity, as she called it, in the most elegant and pathetic expressions, but declined my proposal on account of her attachment to the dear melancholy cottage where she had so peacefully consumed her solitary widowhood. Finding her immovable on this subject, I insisted on her accepting a present of 30 guineas, and took my leave, resolving to accommodate her with the same sum annually, for the more comfortable support of the infirmities of old age. Having rode all night, I found myself at Canterbury in the morning, where I alighted to procure fresh horses, and, as I walked into the inn, perceived an apothecary's on the other side of the street, with the name of Morgan over the door. Alarmed at this discovery, I could not help thinking that my old messmate had settled in this place, and upon inquiry found my conjecture true, and that he was married lately to a widow in that city, by whom he had got £3,000. Rejoiced at this intelligence, I went to his shop as soon as it was open, and found my friend behind the counter, busy in preparing a clyster. I saluted him at entrance with, "Your servant, Mr. Morgan," upon which he looked at me, and replying, "Your most humble servant, good sir," rubbed his ingredients in the mortar without any emotion. "What," said I, "Morgan, have you forgot your old messmate?" At these words he looked up again, and starting, cried, "As caught as my, sure it cannot. Yes, by my salvation, I believe it is my dear friend Mr. Random." He was no sooner convinced of my identity than he threw down the pestle, overset the mortar, and jumping over the board, swept up the contents with his clothes, flew about my neck, hugged me affectionately, and daubed me all over with turpentine and the yolks of eggs which he had been mixing when I came in. Our mutual congratulations being over, he told me that he found himself a widower upon his return from the West Indies, that he had got interest to be appointed surgeon of a man-o'-war, in which capacity he had served some years, until he married an apothecary's widow, with whom he now enjoyed a pretty good sum of money, peace and quiet, and an indifferent good trade. He was very desirous of hearing my adventures, which I assured him I had not time to relate, but told him in general my circumstances were very good, and that I hoped to see him when I should not be in such a hurry as at present. He insisted, however, on my staying breakfast, and introduced me to his wife, who seemed to be a decent, sensible woman, pretty well stricken in years. In the course of our conversation, he showed the sleeve buttons I had exchanged with him at our parting in the West Indies, and was not a little proud to see that I had preserved his with the same care. When I informed him of Maction's condition, he seemed at first to exult over his distress, but after a little recollection said, "Well, he has paid for his malice. I forgive him, and may Cot forgive him likewise." He expressed great concern for the soul of Captain Oakham, which he believed was now gnashing its teeth, but it was some time before I could convince him of Thompson's being alive, at whose good fortune, nevertheless, he was extremely glad. Having renewed our protestations of friendship, I bade the honest Welshman and his spouse farewell, and, taking post-horses, arrived at London that same night, where I found my father in good health, to whom I imparted what I had learned of Narcissa. This indulgent parent approved of my intention of marrying her, even without fortune, provided her brother's consent could not be obtained, promised to make over to me in a few days a sufficiency to maintain her in a fashionable manner, and expressed a desire of seeing this amiable creature, who had captivated me so much. As I had not slept the night before and was besides fatigued with my journey, I found myself under a necessity of taking some repose and went to bed accordingly. Next morning, about 10 o'clock, took a chair and, according to Mrs. Sagely's directions, went to my charmer's lodgings and inquired for Miss Williams. I had not waited in the parlor longer than a minute when this young woman entered and no sooner perceived me than she shrieked and ran backward. But I got between her and the door and, clasping her in my arms, brought her to herself with an embrace. "Good heaven!" cried she. "Mr. Random, is it you indeed? My mistress will run distracted with joy." I told her it was from an apprehension that my sudden appearance might have had some bad effect on my dear Narcissa, that I had desired to see her first, in order to concert some method of acquainting her mistress gradually with my arrival. She approved of my conduct, and after having yielded to the suggestions of her own friendship, in asking if my voyage had been successful, charged herself with that office, and left me glowing with desire of seeing and embracing the object of my love. In a very little time I heard some body coming down the stairs in haste, and the voice of my angel pronounce with an eager tone, "O heaven, is it possible? Where is he?" How were my faculties aroused at this well-known sound? And how was my soul transported when she broke in upon my view in all the bloom of ripened beauty? Grace was in all her steps, heaven in her eye, in every gesture dignity and love. You, whose souls are susceptible of the most delicate impressions, whose tender bosoms have felt the affecting vicissitudes of love, who have suffered an absence of 18 long months from the dear object of your hope, and found at your return the melting fair as kind and constant as your heart can wish, do me justice on this occasion, and conceive what unutterable rapture possessed us both, while we flew into each other's arms. This was no time for speech. Locked in a mutual embrace, we continued some minutes in a silent trance of joy. When I thus encircled all my soul held dear, while I hung over her beauties, beheld her eyes sparkle, and every feature flush with virtuous fondness, when I saw her enchanting bosom heave with undissembled rapture, and knew myself the happy cause, heavens, what was my situation? I am tempted to commit my paper to the flames, and to renounce my pen forever, because its most ardent and lucky expression so poorly describes the emotions of my soul. "O adorable Narcissa," cried I, "O miracle of beauty, love, and truth, I at last fold thee in my arms. I at last can call thee mine. No jealous brother shall thwart our happiness again. Fortune hath at length recompensed me for all my sufferings, and enabled me to do justice to my love." The dear creature smiled ineffably charmingly, and with a look of bewitching tenderness said, "And shall we never part again?" "Never," I replied, "thou wondrous pattern of all earthly perfection, never until death shall divide us. By this ambrosial kiss, 1,000 times more fragrant than the breeze that sweeps the orange grove, I never more will leave thee." As my first transport abated, my passion grew turbulent and unruly. I was giddy with standing on the brink of bliss, and all my virtue and philosophy were scarce sufficient to restrain the inordinate sallies of desire. Narcissa perceived the conflict within me, and with her usual dignity of prudence, called off my imagination from the object in view, and with eager expressions of interested curiosity, desired to know the particulars of my voyage. In this I gratified her inclination, bringing my story down to the present hour. She was infinitely surprised at the circumstance of finding my father, which brought tears into her lovely eyes. She was transported at hearing that approved of my flame, discovered a longing desire of being introduced to him, congratulated herself and me upon my good fortune, and observed that this great and unexpected stroke of fate seemed to have been brought about by the immediate direction of Providence. Having entertained ourselves some hours with the genuine effusions of our souls, I obtained her consent to complete my happiness as soon as my father should judge it proper, and, applying with my own hands a valuable necklace, composed of diamonds and amethysts set alternately, which an old Spanish lady at Paraguay had presented me with, I took my leave, promising to return in the afternoon with Don Rodrigo. When I went home, this generous parent inquired very affectionately about the health of my dear Narcissa, to whom, that I might be the more agreeable, he put into my hand a deed, by which I found myself in possession of £15,000, exclusive of the profits of my own merchandise, which amounted to 3,000 more. After dinner, I accompanied him to the lodgings of my mistress, who, being dressed for the occasion, made a most dazzling appearance. I could perceive him struck with her figure, which I really think was the most beautiful that ever was created under the sun. He embraced her tenderly and told her he was proud of having a son who had spirit to attempt and qualifications to engage the affections of such a fine lady. She blushed at this compliment, and with eyes full of the softest languishment turned upon me, said she should have been unworthy of Mr. Random's attention had she been blind to his extraordinary merit. I made no other answer than a low bow. My father, sighing, pronounced, "Such was once my Charlotte," while the tear rushed into his eye, and the tender heart of Narcissa manifested itself in 2 precious drops of sympathy, which, but for his presence, I would have kissed away. Without repeating the particulars of our conversation, I shall only observe that Don Rodrigo was as much charmed with her good sense as with her appearance, and she was no less pleased with his understanding and polite address. It was determined that he should write to the squire, signifying his approbation of my passion for his sister, and offering a settlement which he should have no reason to reject, and that, if he should refuse the proposal, we would crown our mutual wishes without any further regard to his will. Chapter 68. My father makes a present to Narcissa. The letter is dispatched to her brother. I appear among my acquaintance. Banters behavior, the squire refuses his consent. My uncle comes to town, approves of my choice. I am married. We meet the squire and his lady at the play. Our acquaintance is courted. After having spent the evening to the satisfaction of all present, my father addressed himself thus to Narcissa. "Madam, give me leave to consider you hereafter as my daughter, in which capacity I insist upon your accepting this first instance of my paternal duty and affection." With these words, he put into her hand a bank note of £500, which she no sooner examined than with a low courtesy she replied, "Dear sir, though I have not the least occasion for this supply, I have too great a veneration for you to refuse this proof of your generosity and esteem, which I the more freely receive, because I already look upon Mr. Random's interest as inseparably connected with mine." He was extremely well pleased with her frank and ingenuous reply, upon which we saluted and wished her good night. The letter, at my request, was dispatched to Sussex by an express, and in the meantime Don Rodrigo, to grace my nuptials, hired a ready-furnished house and set up a very handsome equipage. Though I passed the greatest part of the day with the darling of my soul, I found leisure sometimes to be among my former acquaintance, who were astonished at the magnificence of my appearance. Banter in particular was confounded at the vicissitudes of my fortune, the causes of which he endeavored in vain to discover, until I thought fit to disclose the whole secret of my last voyage, partly in consideration of our former intimacy, and partly to prevent unfavorable conjectures, which he and others, in all probability, would have made in regard to my circumstances. He professed great satisfaction at this piece of news, and I had no cause to believe him insincere, when I considered that he would now look upon himself as acquitted of the debt he owed me, and at the same time flatter himself with the hopes of borrowing more. I carried him home to dinner with me, and my father liked his conversation so much that, upon hearing his difficulties, he desired me to accommodate him for the present, and inquire if he would accept of a commission in the army, towards the purchase of which he should willingly lend him money. Accordingly, I gave my friend an opportunity of being alone with me, when, as I expected, he told me that he was just on the point of being reconciled to an old rich uncle, whose heir he was, but wanted a few pieces for immediate expense, which he desired I would lend him and take my bond for the whole. His demand was limited to 10 guineas, and when I put 20 in his hand, he stared at me for some moments. Then, putting it into his purse, "Aye, 'tis all one, you shall have the whole in a very short time." When I had taken his note, to save the expense of a bond, I expressed some surprise that a fellow of his spirit should loiter away his time in idleness, and asked why he did not choose to make his fortune in the army. "What," said he, "throw away money upon a subaltern's commission, and be under the command of a parcel of scoundrels, who have raised themselves above me by the most infamous practices? No, I love independency too well to sacrifice my life, health, and pleasure for such a pitiful consideration." Finding him adverse to this way of life, I changed the subject and returned to Don Rodrigo, who had just received the following epistle from the squire. "Sir, concerning a letter which I received, subscribed R. Random, this is the answer. As for you, I know nothing of you. Your son, or pretended son, I have seen. If he marries my sister, at his peril be it. I do declare that he shall not have 1 farthing of her fortune, which becomes my property, if she takes a husband without my consent. Your settlement, I do believe, is all a sham, and yourself no better than you should be. But if you had all the wealth of the Indies, your son shall never match in our family with the consent of Orson Topal." My father was not much surprised at this polite letter, after having heard the character of the author. And as for me, I was even pleased at his refusal, because I had now an opportunity of showing my disinterested love. By his permission, I waited on my charmer, and having imparted the contents of her brother's letter, at which she wept bitterly, in spite of all my consolation and caresses, the time of our marriage was fixed 2 days. During this interval, in which my soul was wound up to the last stretch of rapturous expectation, Narcissa endeavored to reconcile some of her relations in town to her marriage with me. But, finding them all deaf to her remonstrances, either out of envy or prejudice, she told me with the most enchanting sweetness, while the tears bedewed her lovely cheeks, "Sure the world will no longer question your generosity when you take a poor forlorn beggar to your arms." Affected with her sorrow, I pressed the fair mourner to my breast, and swore that she was more dear and welcome on that account, because she had sacrificed her friends and fortune to her love for me, my uncle, for whose character she had a great veneration. Being by this time come to town, I introduced him to my bride, and, although he was not very much subject to refined sensations, he was struck dumb with admiration at her beauty. After having kissed and gazed at her for some time, he turned to me, saying, "Odds bobs, Rory, a notable prize indeed, finely built and gloriously rigged, I faith. If she ain't well manned when you take the command of her, sirrah, you deserve to go to sea in a cockle shell. No offence, I hope, niece. You must not mind what I say, being, as the saying is, a plain seafaring man, though mayhap I have as much regard for you as another." She received him with great civility, told him she had longed a great while to see a person to whom she was so much indebted for his generosity to Mr. Random, that she looked upon him as her uncle, by which name she begged leave to call him for the future, and that she was very sure he could say nothing that would give her the least offense. The honest captain was transported at her courteous behavior, and insisted upon giving her away at the ceremony, swearing that he loved her as well as if she was his own child, and that he would give 2,000 guineas to the first fruit of our love, as soon as it would squeak. Everything being settled for the solemnization of our nuptials, which were to be performed privately at my father's house, the auspicious hour arrived, when Don Rodrigo and my uncle went in the coach to fetch the bride and Miss Williams, leaving me with a parson, Banter, and Strap, neither of whom had as yet seen my charming mistress. My faithful valet, who was on the rack of impatience to behold a lady of whom he had heard so much, no sooner understood that the coach was returned than he placed himself at a window to have a peep at her as she alighted, and when he saw her, clapped his hands together, turned up the white of his eyes, and with his mouth wide open, remained in a sort of ecstasy, which broke out into "O decert. Qualis in Euroti rippies, out per Yuga synthi exercit Diana choros." The doctor and Banter were surprised to hear my man speak Latin, but when my father led Narcissa into the room, the object of their admiration was soon changed, as appeared in the countenances of both. Indeed, they must have been the most insensible of all beings, could they have beheld without emotion the divine creature that approached. She was dressed in a sack of white satin, embroidered on the breast with gold. The crown of her head was covered with a small French cap, from whence descended her beautiful hair in ringlets that waved upon her snowy neck, which dignified the necklace I had given her. Her looks glowed with modesty and love, and her bosom, through the veil of gauze that shaded it, afforded a prospect of Elysium. I received this inestimable gift of Providence as became me, and in a little time the clergyman did his office, my uncle, at his own earnest request, acting the part of a father to my dear Narcissa, who trembled very much, and had scarce spirits sufficient to support her under this great change of situation. Soon as she was mine by the laws of heaven and earth, I printed a burning kiss upon her lips. My father embraced her tenderly, my uncle hugged her with great affection, and I presented her to my friend Banter, who saluted her in a very polite manner. Miss Williams hung round her neck and went plentifully, while Strap fell upon his knees and begged to kiss his lady's hand, which she presented with great affability. I shall not pretend to describe my own feelings at this juncture. Let it suffice to say that having supped and entertained ourselves till 10 o'clock, I cautioned my Narcissa against exposing her health by sitting up too late, and she was prevailed upon to withdraw with her maid to an apartment destined for us. When she left the room, her face overspread with a blush that set all my blood in a state of fermentation, and made every pulse beat with tenfold vigor. She was so cruel as to let me remain in this condition a full half-hour. When, no longer able to restrain my impatience, I broke from the company, burst into her chamber, pushed out her confidante, and locked the door, and found her, O heaven and earth, a feast 1,000 times more delicious than my most sanguine hopes presaged. But let me not profane the chaste mysteries of Hymen. I was the happiest of men. In the morning I was awaked by 3 or 4 drums, which Banter had placed under the window, upon which I withdrew the curtain and enjoyed the unspeakable satisfaction of contemplating those angelic charms which were now in my possession. Beauty, which, whether sleeping or awake, shot forth peculiar graces. The light darting upon my Narcissa's eyes, she awoke also, and recollecting her situation, hid her blushes in my bosom. I was distracted with joy. I could not believe the evidence of my senses, and looked upon all that had happened as the fictions of a dream. In the meantime, my uncle knocked at the door, and bade me turn out, for I had had a long spell. I rose accordingly, and sent Miss Williams to her mistress, myself receiving the congratulation of Captain Bowling, who rallied me in his sea phrase with great success. In less than an hour, Don Rodrigo led my wife into breakfast, where she received the compliments of the company on her looks, which, they said, if possible, were improved by matrimony. As her delicate ears were offended with none of those indecent ambiguities which are too often spoken on such occasions, she behaved with dignity, unaffected modesty, and ease. And, as a testimony of my affection and esteem, I presented her, in presence of them all, with a deed, by which I settled the whole fortune I was possessed of on her and her heirs forever. She accepted it with a glance of most tender acknowledgment, observed that she could not be surprised at anything of this kind I should do, and desired my father to take the trouble of keeping it, saying, "Next to my own Mr. Random, you are the person in whom I ought to have the greatest confidence." Charmed with her prudent and ingenuous manner of proceeding, he took the paper, and assured her that it should not lose its value while in his custody. As we had not many visits to give and receive, the little time we stayed in town was spent in going to public diversions, where I have the vanity to think Narcissa was seldom eclipsed. One night, in particular, we sent our footman to keep one of the stage boxes, which we no sooner entered than we perceived in the opposite box the squire and his lady, who seemed not a little surprised at seeing us. I was pleased at this opportunity of confronting them, the more because Melinda was robbed of all her admirers by my wife, who happened that night to outshine her sister both in beauty and dress. She was piqued at Narcissa's victory, tossed her head 1,000 different ways, flirted her fan, looked at us with disdain, then whispered to her husband, and broke out into an affected giggle. But all her arts proved ineffectual, either to discompose Mrs. Random or to conceal her own mortification, which at length forced her away long before the play was done. The news of our marriage being spread, with many circumstances to our disadvantage, by the industry of this malignant creature, a certain set of persons fond of scandal began to inquire into the particulars of my fortune, which they no sooner understood to be independent than the tables were turned, and our acquaintance was courted as much as it had been despised before. But she had too much dignity of pride to encourage this change of conduct, especially in her relations, whom she could never be prevailed upon to see, after the malicious reports they had raised to her prejudice. Chapter 69. My father intends to revisit the place of his nativity. We propose to accompany him. My uncle renews his will in my favor, determining to go to sea again. We set out for Scotland, arrive at Edinburgh, purchase our paternal estate, proceed to it, halt at the town where I was educated, take up my bond to Crabbe, the behavior of Potion and his wife, and one of our female cousins, our reception at the estate. Strap marries Miss Williams, and is settled by my father to his own satisfaction. I am more and more happy. My father intending to revisit his native country and pay the tribute of a few tears at my mother's grave, Narcissa and I resolved to accompany him in the execution of his pious office, and accordingly prepared for the journey, in which, however, my uncle would not engage, being resolved to try his fortune once more at sea. In the meantime, he renewed his will in favor of my wife and me, and deposited it in the hands of his brother-in-law. While I, that I might not be wanting to my own interest, summoned the squire to produce his father's will at Doctors' Commons, and employed a proctor to manage the affair in my absence. Everything being thus settled, we took leave of all our friends in London, and set out for Scotland, Don Rodrigo, Narcissa, Miss Williams, and I in the coach and Strap with 2 men in livery on horseback. As we made easy stages, my charmer held it out very well, till we arrived at Edinburgh, where we proposed to rest ourselves some weeks. Here Don Rodrigo, having intelligence that the fox hunter had spoilt his estate, which was to be exposed to sale by public auction, he determined to make a purchase of the spot where he was born, and actually bought all the land that belonged to his father. In a few days after this bargain was made, we left Edinburgh in order to go and take possession, and by the way halted one night in that town where I was educated. Upon inquiry, I found that Mr. Crabbe was dead, whereupon I sent for his executor, paid the sum I owed with interest, and took up my bond. Mr. Potion and his wife, hearing of my arrival, had the assurance to come to the inn where we lodged, and send up their names, with the desire of being permitted to pay their respects to my father and me. But their sordid behavior towards me, when I was an orphan, had made too deep an impression on my mind to be effaced by this mean mercenary piece of condescension. I therefore rejected their message with disdain, and bade Strap tell them that my father and I desired to have no communication with such low-minded wretches as they were. They had not been gone half an hour, when a woman, without any ceremony, opened the door of the room where we sat, and making towards my father, accosted him with, "Uncle, your servant, I am glad to see you." This was no other than one of my female cousins, mentioned in the first part of my memoirs, to whom Don Rodrigo replied, "Pray, who are you, madam?" "Oh," cried she, "my cousin Rory there knows me very well. Don't you remember me, Rory?" "Yes, madam," said I. "For my own part, I shall never forget you. Sir, this is one of the young ladies who, as I have formerly told you, treated me so humanely in my childhood." When I pronounced these words, my father's resentment glowed in his visage, and he ordered her to be gone with such a commanding aspect that she retired in a fright, muttering curses as she went downstairs. We afterwards learned that she was married to an ensign who had already spent all her fortune, and that her sister had borne a child to her mother's footman, who is now her husband and keeps a petty alehouse in the country. The fame of our flourishing condition having arrived at this place before us, we got notice that the magistrates intended next day to compliment us with the freedom of their town. Upon which my father, considering their complaisance in the right point of view, ordered the horses to the coach early in the morning. We proceeded to our estate, which lay about 20 miles from this place, and when we came within half a league of the house, were met by a prodigious number of poor tenants, men, women, and children, who testified their joy by loud acclamations, and accompanied our coach to the gate. As there is no part of the world in which the peasants are more attached to their lords than in Scotland, we were almost devoured by their affections. My father had always been their favorite, and now that he appeared their master, after having been thought dead so long, their joy broke out into 1,000 extravagances. When we entered the courtyard, we were surrounded by a vast number, who crowded together so closely to see us that several were in danger of being squeezed to death. Those who were near Don Rodrigo fell upon their knees and kissed his hand or the hem of his garment, praying aloud for long life and prosperity to him. Others approached Narcissa and me in the same manner, while the rest clapped their hands at a distance and invoked heaven to shower its choicest blessings on our heads. In short, the whole scene, though rude, was so affecting that the gentle partner of my heart wept over it, and my father himself could not refrain from dropping a tear. Having welcomed his daughter and me to his house, he ordered some bullocks to be killed and some hogsheads of ale to be brought from the neighboring village, to regale these honest people, who had not enjoyed such a holiday for many years before. Next day we were visited by the gentlemen in the neighborhood, most of them our relations, one of whom brought along my cousin, the fox hunter, who had stayed at his house since he was obliged to leave his own. My father was generous enough to receive him kindly, and even promised to purchase for him a commission in the army, for which he expressed great thankfulness and joy. My charming Narcissa was universally admired and loved for her beauty, affability, and good sense, and so well pleased with the situation of the place, and the company round, that she has not as yet discovered the least desire of changing her habitation. We had not been many days settled, when I prevailed upon my father to pay a visit to the village where I had been at school. Here we were received by the principal inhabitants, who entertained us in the church, where Mr. Syntax the schoolmaster, my tyrant being dead, pronounced a Latin oration in honor of our family. And none exerted themselves more than Strap's father and relations, who looked upon the honest valet as the first gentleman of their race and honored his benefactors accordingly. Having received the homage of this place, we retired, leaving £40 for the benefit of the poor of the parish. And that very night, Strap being a little elevated with the regard that had been shown to him, and to me on his account, ventured to tell me that he had a sneaking kindness for Miss Williams, and that, if his lady and I would use our interest in his behalf, he did not doubt that she would listen to his addresses. Surprised at this proposal, I asked if he knew the story of that unfortunate young gentlewoman, upon which he replied, "Yes, yes, I know what you mean. She has been unhappy, I grant you. But what of that? I am convinced of her reformation, or else you and my good lady would not treat her with such respect. As for the censure of the world, I value it not a fig's end. Besides, the world knows nothing of the matter." I commended his philosophy, and interested Narcissa in his cause, who interceded so effectually that in a little time Miss Williams yielded her consent, and they were married at the approbation of Don Rodrigo, who gave him £500 to stock a farm and made him overseer of his estate. My generous bedfellow gave her maid the same sum, so that they live in great peace and plenty within half a mile of us, and daily put up prayers for our preservation. If there be such a thing as true happiness on earth, I enjoy it. The impetuous transports of my passion are now settled and mellowed into endearing fondness and tranquility of love, rooted by that intimate connection and interchange of hearts, which naught but virtuous wedlock can produce. Fortune seems determined to make ample amends for her former cruelty. For my proctor writes that, notwithstanding the clause in my father-in-law's will, on which the squire founds his claim, I shall certainly recover my wife's fortune, in consequence of a codicil annexed, which explains that clause and limits her restriction to the age of 19, after which she was at her own disposal. I would have set out for London immediately after receiving this piece of intelligence, but my dear angel has been qualmish of late, and begins to grow remarkably round in the waist, so that I cannot leave her in such an interesting situation, which I hope will produce something to crown my felicity.